or protective of their partner, so they may not tell the truth about what happened, end quote.
If there's anything about Maya's story or Emma's story that sounds familiar because you're experiencing it in your own relationship, you need to tell someone. Even if you're not sure. Honestly, especially if you're not sure. Tell your parents, your best friend, a teacher, a grandparent, a neighbor, even the police, but tell someone. If things don't feel right, it's because they probably aren't right. You guys, I can't stress this enough. Trust your gut. Abusers are very, very good at making you feel like it's your fault, or worse, like it's all in your head. At least by telling someone, you can get a second opinion. Healthy relationships should lift you up, not tear you down. They should make you feel better and not worse. And they should never, ever leave marks on your body or your mind. For more information on teen dating violence, including where to go for help, visit loveisrespect.org. If you think that your browser history may be monitored, you can also call them at 1-866-331-9474, or you can text LOVE IS, all one word, to 22522. We're actually going to be making a donation to this organization, and we're going to include all of that information and more in the show notes and on our website. For all the source material on this episode, please visit our website, crimejunkiepodcast.com.
And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Crime Junkie Podcast.
We will be back next week with another episode, but stick around for Prophet of the Month. Crime Junkie is an audio Chuck production. So, what do you think, Chuck? Do you agree?
So today's Puppet was submitted by our listener Joe about his best friend Gary. He adopted Gary, the most gorgeous white dog, from a shelter in Montana. And Gary had actually come from the meat trade in South Korea.
What?
And had been rescued, moved to Montana to find a forever home, and found Joe. Now, Joe is a big fan of motorcycles, and in late 2018, shortly after we got Gary, he had bought a new motorcycle. Now, after I haven't been to Montana, have you?
No.
But that late in the year, I assume it's pretty cold, and probably not the best, motorcycle weather. So Joe put his new bike in a trailer and went down to Las Vegas for a few days to try out his new bike. And Gary went to a sleepover at Grandma and Grandpa's house, Joe's parents. Every morning, Gary would go out with Joe's parents' dog, Witten, for a little morning stroll around the neighborhood. They went together every morning for about an hour, just the two of them, walking around the neighborhood. It was the cutest thing ever, and every morning they came back. Until one day, Gary didn't. And Joe's parents started freaking out. They didn't tell him right away. They went out looking for Gary all day. But they finally broke the news to Joe, who was on the last night of his trip in Las Vegas. Joe said he barely slept that night, and the 12-hour drive from Vegas home the next day flew by. All he wanted to do was get home and find Gary. Now, this was now New Year's Day 2019, and Facebook friends, family, everyone in their little town was out and about looking for Gary with absolutely no luck. Now, a week goes by, and one morning, one of his mom's coworkers calls and she's like, Gary is on my porch. Come now. And so Gary's mom hops in the car, runs to her coworker's house, and as soon as she hops out of the car, Gary takes off. So she calls her husband. He comes out. He tries to chase Gary down. Nothing. that they got so excited about the idea of finding Gary and bringing him home to Joe, they forgot to tell Joe.
Oh no.
So they finally called Joe, wake him up, and they're like, oh, we need your help because I think we have Gary. So Joe heads out to his mom's coworker's place. He sees Gary off in the distance, kind of walking away. Joe calls him. Gary immediately stops, turns tail, and runs straight into Joe's arms. And they still have no idea where Gary was for that entire week he had been missing. But it looked like he'd been well taken care of. I mean, this is a white dog. You would kind of know if he was living on the streets, right? So they assumed someone found him, took him in for a few days, and saw the ad about a missing dog that Joe's mom had put in their local paper, which I think is the sweetest. And they're like, oh, shoot. And they kicked Gary out to head home. And it's been 3 years since. Gary is still besties with Joe. They are now living with Joe's girlfriend and her 3 sons, who all adore Gary. They're the 4 sons, really. And they can still be a little bit skittish around new people, but Joe said it hasn't stopped them from living their best lives together.
Did he ever get him a sidecar for his motorcycle? Because like that's what I need to know.
That's like the goal. So Joe, if you haven't done that yet, I think Gary would really appreciate going on some of those trips with you. And as always, I want to highlight a rescue local to our campus, so be sure to check out the Humane Society of Northwest Montana, which we will be linking to on our website, along with pictures of Gary at crimejunkiepodcast.com.
Hi, Crime Junkies. I'm your host, Ashley Clowers.
And I'm Britt.
And the story I have for you today is one that first came to our attention in the spring of 2021 when we got an email from a listener named Emily that started like this. Hello, Ashley and Britt. My name is Emily, and until December 6th of 2020, I was a religious listener and Crime Junkie fan club member. I still love you both and your show. I had to stop listening for a while because my 26-year-old autistic sister went missing, and I became a full-time investigator working 18-plus hour days trying to find her. I used a lot of my Crime Junkie knowledge. My sister's name is Erica Jean Schultz, and she was from Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. She went on to tell us the most incredible story of one sister fighting for justice for another. And she sent us another text message that said, quote, "It's because of Crime Junkie that I had the knowledge and the courage to take the actions necessary," end quote. And I truly believe it's because of the actions she took that a serial predator was taken off the streets. Emily asked us to tell her sister's story, and really it's her story too, because she thinks our platform could help get the word out and possibly help others find closure. So with the help of her sister Emily, here is the story of Erica Jean Schultz. At around noon on Saturday, December 5th, 2020, Emily Corbin is working from home in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, when she hears a notification on her phone. It's a text from someone she knows named Donna, and she wants to know if Emily's sister, 26-year-old Erica Schultz, happened to be with her. Donna has something that she needs to drop off to Erica's apartment, but she hasn't been able to get a hold of Erica, and she isn't answering her phone. Now, Emily says, no, Erica isn't with her, but she says, don't worry, I'll track her down and have her give you a call back. Emily punches in her sister's number, but Erica doesn't answer for her either, which isn't a super big deal. Emily knows that Erica loves her a good, Saturday morning sleeping, so she's either at home in bed with the ringer off, or maybe she just got called in last minute to cover an extra shift at work. And if that's the case, their mom probably drove her there. But Emily checks with their mom, who says that she hasn't seen or heard from Erica yet that day either. Emily calls her own husband, Cody, and asks him to just swing by the Weiss Market where Erica works on his way home and see if she's there. But she's not. Cody goes from there to Erica's apartment, but she's not there either. So all 4 of them, Emily and her mom, Donna and Cody, start taking turns calling Erica's cell over and over all afternoon. Emily is racking her brain trying to figure out where her sister could possibly be. She knows Erica's schedule pretty well. They talk every day, even several times a day. And there's not much that goes on in either of their lives without the other one knowing about it.
So when was the last time that Emily spoke to or even saw her sister?
Well, she spoke to her the night before. Susan Schwartz reported for the Press Enterprise that Emily FaceTimed with her sister around 8 o'clock on Friday night. And at that point, Erica had been home in her PJs working on a puzzle and getting ready for bed. There was nothing out of the ordinary about that conversation. They chatted about the puzzle, and Erica joked about how she and her cat Luna were working on it together. It wasn't a lengthy call by any means, just like a quick good night, love you, talk to you in the morning kind of thing. Not hearing from her sister until noon, she can brush that off. But as the hours tick by, her worry is really starting to grow. Because Erica talks to her family all of the time. And by all of the time, I mean, like, it would not be out of character for her to call her mom and sister like 15 times in a day or more, according to that Press Enterprise.
Oh, wow. So they're a pretty tight bunch.
Really tight. But actually, in Erica's case, it's actually more than just like being close to family. You see, Erica is autistic, and while she is very independent in lots of ways, like she has a job, she has her own place, all of that, she still relies on her mom and sister for a lot of things. Like she doesn't have a license, so usually one of them drives her like to and from work, for example. But again, Erica also has her own life. She has her own friends, she has her own interests, and it is totally possible that Emily doesn't know every single thing that's going on every minute of her sister's life. But Emily thinks that if her sister had made any plans she didn't know about, there has to be a record of it somewhere. Like if Erica used Facebook or Instagram or something like that, Emily might be able to get into her accounts and find out who she was meeting and where. And for some people, that might be more of a, wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of info kind of thing. But Emily Corbin is not some people. She is our people. She told our team, quote, "I have been a crime junkie for a long time and would constantly talk to Cody and Erica about the importance of passwords and having a go missing folder," end quote.
I love this girl already. Oh my goodness.
I swear my crime junkie heart grew 3 sizes when I read that. So yeah, Emily for sure doesn't know all of her sister's usernames and passwords, but she knows enough to give her a leg up. Plus, Erica had logged into Facebook a few times before on Emily's phone, which set up an autofill, so Emily was able to access several of her sister's accounts right away, like that very afternoon. Unfortunately, though, if Erica had made plans with someone, it wasn't through any of those channels.
Okay, but it's still great to have those things like locked, loaded, ready to go, even just so she can watch them for activity. Or at least, that's what I'd be doing. And Ashley, you have an If I Go Missing folder. I have an If I Go Missing folder. We have an If I Go Missing folder template on our website that all of our crime junkies can download. It's there, use it.
Yeah, we did that episode a long time ago, but for anyone who's new or didn't realize, there's literally something you can download on our website. We have an If I Go Missing folder that has just tons of information. And at the end of the day, right, like Emily said, they didn't have everything, but she had enough to get research started.
Right, and like our folder, I feel like covers a lot, but there's still things that if you think they're important, put them in there.
Yeah, and again, you hope you never have to use it. You hope you are never in the position Emily is, but when you are, you don't want to be looking back and wishing you had made something. By 4 p.m., Emily and her mom are concerned enough that they decide to head to Erica's apartment. Now, she wasn't there earlier, but again, they're thinking like, okay, she went to with a friend, which they think she might have. Maybe she's back now. Maybe her phone died or something. But when they show up, they get no answer. So they use the key that each of them had to let themselves in. And the moment they walk through the door, they know that something is wrong. The first thing that they notice is that Luna's food and water dish are turned upside down and empty. It looked to them like Luna was trying to get what little bit of food was left inside the automatic dishes. Now, Emily and her mom both know that if Erica was planning on being away, she would have made sure that there was plenty of food and water for Luna. And she would have told one or both of them about it so they could take care of Luna while she was gone. And listen, if I'm ever gone and there were no plans made for Chuck, all the red flags, my husband murdered me. And that's kind of how, like, Emily is saying Erica feels about her cat. Like, there's no way in the world she would just, like, leave her to fend for herself. And there's a reason for that. Like, again, it's not just that she's a beloved pet. She's actually an emotional support animal. And for Erica to even have Luna, Emily told us that she had to sign papers saying that if something ever happened to her sister, she would take responsibility for the cat.
So, is there anything else in Erica's place that seems off as they keep looking?
Yes, so her medications are actually left there next to the kitchen sink. Like, she would always put out, like, her daily medication each day so she didn't forget to take them. And Saturday's pills were sitting there untouched. But still, they're like, no, things happen. People forget, people get tied up. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. So they keep looking. They check the drawer where Erica kept her medication. Maybe she grabbed the next day's dose by accident. But the rest of the month of December was all there. This worries them a little bit more. And there's something else that they can't shake. Erica's winter coat is lying on the couch. And this is December in Pennsylvania. People don't just venture outside for any length of time without a coat.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I would maybe like run to my car real quick without a coat, but if I was gonna be gone for more than a couple of minutes, I'd want my coat with me for sure.
Well, yeah, and again, remember, Erica doesn't have a license. She doesn't have a car. She doesn't drive. But she did have this purple Columbia fleece that she would sometimes wear as a jacket on milder days, or if she was just going to be outside, like you're saying, for like long enough to climb into someone else's car. But even that, they find hanging in the closet. Her overnight bag was in the closet too. And as far as they could tell, the only things missing were her purse and her cell phone and Erica herself. So the next thing they do is look around for any clues as to where she may have gone or who she may have met, but they find nothing. So with an uneasy feeling, Emily and her mom decide that all they can really do is go home, keep trying Erica's phone, and hope for the best.
So they don't report her missing?
No, not at this point. Emily told us that, like so many others, she and her mom were under the impression that they should wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. And so they decided to give it a day before involving police. And again, another kind of rule here, that's not an actual rule anywhere. Now, that's not guaranteeing that when you go, police won't tell you that. It's not saying that they promise to take the report. There are agencies that still won't take it. There's no official rule that you have to wait if you ever find yourself in a situation like this. But they thought this was a rule. So they go home, and again, in the back of their minds, there's still this sliver of hope that this has all just been a series of unfortunate events. And Erica is just gonna like show up. She's gonna like explain everything away once she walks through the door. Now, they know that she's scheduled to work at 5 p.m. on Sunday. So that's kind of like the marker they put in their mind. Like if Erica doesn't show up at home by 4 to get ready, then we're gonna call police. But neither of them realized just how long those 24 hours was going to be. And after trying all day Sunday to reach Erica by phone, by about 3:30, they just can't wait any longer. They grab their stuff and head back to Erica's apartment to wait for her there. The next 90 minutes feels like hours. They call the Weiss Market to double check that Erica's on the schedule, and she is. So Emily calls her husband Cody and asks him to go sit in the Weiss parking lot and just watch to see if maybe someone else drops Erica off for her shift. Emily told us she had a reason for asking Cody to stake out the parking lot, more than just to put eyes on her sister. She said, quote, "I was thinking that maybe if she was with someone and they took her directly to work, I could get their description or license plate and check that person out," end quote.
I mean, I don't blame her. If someone had my sister off the grid for that long, I'd gotta check them out too.
Yeah, but Erica doesn't show, solo or without. She is officially a no-call, no-show. And that is absolutely 100% not like her. She wouldn't do that ever. So at about 10 after 5, Emily calls 911 and officially reports her sister missing. She gives them all the details, when they last saw her, how she is answering her phone, didn't show up to work, didn't take her medications or winter coat, didn't even leave food for her cat. She tells them Erica is especially vulnerable because of her autism. According to Emily, even though Erica was 26, she had the mentality of someone closer to 15, which Emily says opened her up to being easily manipulated, and she was very trusting. Now, this part of the story is a little bit of a punch in the gut to me and kind of makes me think that even if Emily and her mom had gone to the police sooner, nothing would have happened. Because the officer tells Emily to just wait a little bit longer. And if Erica doesn't show up by 6:30, maybe call back then and then we'll start the paperwork.
Okay, what the heck is 90 more minutes gonna do when they've already waited 24 hours? I mean, more than that, really.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I keep coming back to this one thing that Emily told us, which I'm going to actually get you to read, Britt.
She says, quote, "We live in a small town, and the police don't have a lot of experience with situations like this, especially when someone has an intellectual disability. They asked us if Erica could have met someone and moved away to start a new life, or if she just went away with friends for a couple of days and would return soon. They were all valid questions, but not for our situation. Erica didn't die. She didn't miss her medications or work. She was living her best life and would never, ever leave us or her family." unquote.
Eventually, police agreed to open a missing persons investigation. Emily and her mom are still at Erica's apartment at this point, and so they check her laptop for any passwords to social media or other sites, anything that might help them access her accounts. And then they take the laptop and an old cell phone of Erica's to give to the police. Emily and her mom get no sleep that night. And though she tries to work from home the next day, it's incredibly difficult. Her mind is going a million miles a minute. Thankfully, Emily told us she has an awesome boss who tells her, you know what, don't worry about work, just do what you need to do. And of course, Emily isn't an investigator. She doesn't actually know what to do. But she said she had listened to enough episodes of this show, she'd watched enough Dateline in 2020 to know that the key to finding Erica is out there somewhere. And she's not just going to sit idly by and wait for police to find it. No one knows Erica better than she does, which means no one is better equipped to find her. So she starts her own investigation. Emily grabs this pink, glittery notebook out of the bottom of her desk drawer and opens it up to the first page. She writes the date on top, Monday, December 7th, 2020, and she starts to write. She writes the exact time of her last conversation with Erica and everything she can remember about it. She writes about the text from Donna and when it came in. She writes down every single call she made to Erica's phone and what time she made them. She writes about going to the apartment and what she saw, what was there and what was missing. She notes all of the people she or Cody or her mom called or texted or spoke to, what they asked, what was said. In her gut, Emily knows that her sister didn't just leave on her own. She had to have gone with someone. She just doesn't know who. But she figures there has to be a way to find out. And so that's when Emily switches into what I can only describe as a full-on crime mode. She calls the building manager of her sister's apartment complex to see if they have any security cameras. They don't, so she calls the Napa Auto Parts store behind the building to see if they have any cameras, but they don't. She makes
deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. This is a move that has strong bipartisan support in Congress and I believe in the country. Americans have rallied to support their Ukrainian people and made it clear we will not require the fertilizing people. We made this decision in close consultation with our allies and our partners around the world, particularly in Europe, because the united response to aggression and overriding purpose to keep all and moving forward this plan, understanding that many of our European allies may not be in a position to join us. The United States produces far more oil domestically than all the European countries combined. In fact, we're a net exporter of energy. So we can take this step when others cannot. But we're working closely with Europe and our partners to develop a long-term strategy to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. Our teams are actively discussing how to make this happen. Today, we remain united. Keep pressure mounting on the machine. This is a step that we're taking to further pain. Cost as well here in the United States. I said I would love it with the American people from the beginning. When I first spoke to this, I said defending freedom is going to cost. It's going to cost us as well in the United States. Republicans and Democrats understand that. Republicans and Democrats alike have been clear that we must do this. Over the last week, I spoke with President Zelensky several times, with him about the situation on the ground and consult. Continue to consult with our European allies and about U.S. support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Thus far, we've provided more than $1 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. Shipments of defensive weapons are arriving in Ukraine every day from the United States, and we, the United States, are the ones coordinating the delivery of our allies and partners of similar weapons from Germany to Finland to the Netherlands. We're working that out. We're also providing humanitarian support to Ukraine, both those still in Ukraine and those who have fled safely to neighboring countries. We're working with humanitarian organizations to surge tens of thousands of tons of food, water, and medical supplies into Ukraine. There's more on the way. Over the weekend, I sent Secretary Blinken to visit the border between Poland and Ukraine and to Moldova to see what the situation was firsthand and report back. General Miller, Vice President Harris is going to be traveling to meet with our allies in Poland and Romania later this week as well. I've made it clear the United States will share in the responsibility of caring for the refugees, and the cost will not fall entirely on the European countries bordering Ukraine. And yesterday I spoke with my counterparts in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom about Russia's escalating violence against Ukraine and the steps that we're going to take, together with our allies and partners around the world, to respond to this aggression. We are enforcing the most significant package of economic sanctions in history, and it's causing significant damage to Russia's economy. It has caused Russian economy to, quite frankly, crater. The Russian ruble is now down to 50%, by 50% since Putin's announced his war. 1 ruble is now worth less than 1 American penny. 1 ruble less than 1 American penny. And preventing Russia's central bank from propping up the ruble to keep its value up. They're not going to be able to do that now. We cut the Russians' largest banks from the international financial system, and it's crippled their ability to do business with the rest of the world. In addition, we're choking off Russia's access to technology, semiconductors, and sap its economic strength and weaken its military for years to come. Major companies are pulling out of Russia entirely without even being asked, not by us. Over the weekend, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they all suspended their services in Russia, all of them. Joining a growing list of American companies, Ford to Nike to Apple, they've suspended their operations in Russia. The U.S. Stock Exchange has halted trading of many Russian securities. The private sector is united against Russia's vicious war of choice. The U.S. Department of Justice has assembled a dedicated task force to go after the crimes of Russian oligarchs. And we're joining with our European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets, all their ill-begotten gains to make sure that they share in the pain of Putin's war. These, by the way, are giant yachts. You put some of them in the press. I mean, some of them are, I think I read one was over 400 feet long. I mean, this is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The decision today is not without cost here at home. Putin's war is already hurting American families at the gas pump. Since Putin began his military buildup on Ukrainian borders, just since then, the price of the gas at the pump in America went up 75 cents. And with this action, it's going to go up further. I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home. In coordination with our partners, we've already announced that we're releasing 60 million barrels of oil from our joint oil reserve. Half of that, 30 billion, is coming from the United States. And we're taking steps to ensure a reliable supply of global energy. We're also going to keep working every tool at our disposal to protect American families and businesses. Now, let me say this. To the oil and gas companies, to the finance firms that back them, we understand Putin's war against the people of Ukraine is causing prices to rise. We get that. That's self-evident. But, it's no excuse to exercise excessive price increases or padding profits or any kind of effort to exploit this situation or American consumers. Exploit them. Russia's aggression is costing us all, and it's no time for profiteering or price gouging. I want to be clear about what we'll not tolerate, but I also want to acknowledge those firms, oil and gas industries that are pulling out of Russia and joining other businesses that are leading by example. This is a time when we have to do our part to make sure we're not taking advantage. Look, let me be clear about 2 other points. First, it's simply not true that my administration has policies of holding back domestic energy production. It's simply not true. Even amid the pandemic, companies in the United States pumped more oil during my first year in office than they did during my predecessor's first year. We're approaching a record levels of oil and gas production in the United States, and we're on track to set a record oil production next year. In the United States, 90% of onshore oil production takes place on land that isn't owned by the federal government. And of the remaining 10% that occurs on federal land. The oil and gas industry has millions of acres leased. They have 9,000 permits to drill now. They could be drilling right now, yesterday, last week, last year. They have 9,000 to drill onshore that are already approved. So let me be clear. They are not using them for production now. That's their decision. These are the facts. We should be honest about the facts. Second, this crisis is a stark reminder. To protect our economy in the long term, we need to become energy independent. I've had numerous conversations over the last few months with European friends how they have to clean themselves out of Russia. It's just not tenable. It should motivate us to accelerate the transition. This is a perspective as our European allies share. And in the future, where together we can achieve greater independence. Loosening environmental regulations and pulling back clean energy investment won't, let me expand, will not lower energy prices. Transforming our economy to run on electric vehicles powered by clean energy with tax credits to help American families winterize their homes and use less energy, that will help. And if we do what we can, it will mean that no one has to worry about the price of the gas pump in the future. That'll mean tyrants like Putin won't be able to use fossil fuels as weapons against other nations. And it will make America the world leader in manufacturing and exporting clean energy technology of the future to countries all around the world. This is the goal we should be racing for. Over the last 2 weeks, Ukrainian people have inspired the world. I mean that in the literal sense. They've inspired the world with their bravery, their patriotism, defiant determination to live free. Putin's war has caused enormous suffering and needless loss of life. Women, children, everyone is Ukraine. Both Ukraine and, I might add, Russia. Ukrainian leaders, as well as leaders around the world, have repeatedly called for a ceasefire, for humanitarian relief, for real diplomacy. But Putin seems determined to continue on his murderous path, no matter the cost.
Welcome back with our world lead. President Biden today announced a full ban on Russian oil, natural gas, and coal imports to the United States. President Biden saying he hopes this will, quote, deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. Joining us live to discuss, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, who serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and met with President Zelensky in Ukraine before the invasion. Senator, how big of an impact will this make in deterring Vladimir Putin's bloodshed in Ukraine, especially given the fact that this is a unilateral move made independently of European allies, though I'm sure Biden tried to get them on board?
Listen, this is not a symbolic move, but without Russia, without Europe, the impact on Russia's economy of just removing their oil from import to the United States is probably limited. I think there's a moral imperative for the United States to not send money to fund Putin's war, but we are a very small share of Russia's exports, and so doing this without Europe, I don't think is necessarily going to fundamentally change Putin's calculus. It's ultimately going to be the accumulation of the impact of all of these economic sanctions that may eventually cause Putin to realize he may have a choice to be made between perpetuating this war in Ukraine and keeping a hold on power. So I'm glad the president went ahead with it. I think we got to be careful to make sure that there's not too big an impact on American consumers. But without Europe, the impact on Putin remains to be seen.
Russian oil supplies, as you noted, it's only a small slice of U.S. energy needs, just 8% in 2021. In the second half of February, the Department of Energy reported that imports dropped to zero as U.S. companies cut ties with Russia. So I guess I wonder, given the fact that American companies were already doing this, what do you say about this ban? Was it necessary even? Was the free market already doing it?
But as the United States economy continues to rev up, there was certainly going to be an increased demand on energy consumption, and thus you always have the possibility of private companies bringing in Russian energy. I think it makes sense to have this policy on the books. I just don't know that we should overhype its impact. Ultimately, the broader sanctions that we have levied on Russian banks and news of all of these private companies, from Starbucks to Coca-Cola to MasterCard, pulling out of Russia, that's really where the primary impact is going to be. But let's just admit the insanity of a U.S. economy that continues to run on oil that is provided to us by dictators. The reality is, if we're not getting this oil from Russia, we're likely going to be importing more from another brutal dictator in Saudi Arabia, for instance, or we may have to go to Venezuela for oil. We should ultimately learn our lesson and become energy independent and choose to invest in clean domestic energy, so we never have to choose between one dictator versus another.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans say the same thing, except they're not talking about clean energy. They're just talking about American fossil fuels from Louisiana or ANWR or Keystone. But on that subject, though, you raise an important point. You talk about the moral imperative of the United States not funding Putin's brutal, barbaric war against the Ukrainian people, but the solution to that is that we're now going to be funding Maduro in Venezuela or the mullahs in Iran or the Saudi regime. I mean, these are also governments that are doing things that they'll take our money and use it to do things that are morally repugnant.
Well, I don't think massive U.S. oil imports from Venezuela or Iran coming anytime soon. It is, though likely, we are going to need to import more oil from the Saudis, and on any given day, the behavior of the Saudi regime rivals that of the Venezuelans and the Iranians. I think you need to remember, when you talk about domestic oil production, there's no guarantee that that stays in the United States. When we produce oil here in the United States, that goes to the highest bidder. Sometimes that's here in the U.S., but oftentimes that oil gets sent to China. That oil gets sent to Europe. Renewable energy stays in the United States. When we are producing energy from solar panels or from wind turbine, that stays on the American grid. So if you really care about keeping American-made energy in the United States, you should be investing in renewables.
So gas prices are at record highs, and a lot of Americans were already struggling to buy gas for their car. This might not affect you or me, but people in rural America who travel long distances, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, this really makes a difference. What can the administration, the Congress do to help those struggling Americans? Polls indicate that people, including a majority of Republicans, are willing to sacrifice for this moral imperative. But what more can be done for the people who really can't afford this?
No, listen, I think you're exactly right, and I've frankly been saying this for the last several days, is that I frankly didn't want the administration to move out too quickly on this policy without making sure that we could backfill that Russian oil, because I do think it's really easy for the political elites in Washington to tell low-income consumers they should pay more for a gallon of gasoline in order to save Ukraine. That's a lot harder for people that don't have the extra money in Waterbury, Connecticut. So I think in the short run, that probably does mean we're going to have to bring in more oil from places like Saudi Arabia. I'm interested in a proposal that some of my colleagues have here to temporarily suspend the gas tax or lower the gas tax to try to defray the costs for consumers. But I think as long as this war is happening in Ukraine, the market is going to price in an amount of instability that's going to keep energy prices high.
Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, thank you so much. Good to see you, sir.
Let's discuss what's going on with retired U.S. General David Petraeus, a former CENTCOM commander, also former CIA Director General. Thanks so much for joining us. As you know, the U.S. now believes 8 to 10% of Russian military assets have already been destroyed in less than 2 weeks of fighting. Can they sustain that rate of loss for several more weeks or even months?
Well, it remains to be seen, Wolf. I very much agree with Jim's assessment. It's a grinding affair. Also, the assessment by retired General Anderson that, again, it's a race between our efforts to supply the Ukrainians and the Russian efforts to actually resupply their forces. Their logistics have been woefully inadequate so far, and to get set so they can finally launch what they believe will be the main effort attack on Kyiv. Of course, they want to replace the Zelensky government with one that is pro-Russian. That's the overriding objective. But it's also a race, I think, Wolf, to see how long the Russian soldiers can maintain the intensity. They're about to enter the most difficult of all combat, and that is urban combat. We used to discuss, how long can you keep soldiers doing this? How many more buildings, how many more rooms can a soldier enter? Each time they enter, the adrenaline's pumping. It's a very grinding, draining experience. And I don't know that Russia has the replacement. You'll recall in Iraq and Afghanistan, we replaced some of our forces every 6 months. Our soldiers, our Army forces were replaced every 12 months, 15 months during the surge, a long time in combat, but we always had that rotation going. I'm not confident that Russia can replace the forces that it's losing, much less the entire complement of the forces when they're spent, when they culminate. And again, this is not just physical, and it is grinding physically, again, urban combat, but it's also the mental toll that urban combat takes on those who are the boots on the ground. And when you strip away all the other systems and logistics and tanks and artillery and so forth, this really comes down to infantry on the ground who are going to have to go in after Russia has pummeled, in some cases rubbled, areas of the city and clear those. And in the meantime, on the other side, you have the Ukrainian defenders fighting for their homeland, determined not to let Russia take their capital. And this is going to be a tremendous showdown. And I'm not convinced that Russia can just crush Ukraine the way that many observers perhaps thought before we saw how woeful some aspects of Russian tactics, logistics, and even campaign design have been.
Yeah, it certainly hasn't happened yet. The CIA director, you heard her, you heard him say Putin overestimated his own military capacity while underestimating Ukrainian resistance as well as the international response. So why did Putin so gravely, by all accounts, miscalculate?
Well, I'm sure that, first of all, a lot of his advisors were very cowed, very intimidated by him. You even saw that, actually, with his showdown with his intelligence chief in one of those bizarre, surreal conferences that he had, long speech and so forth. Beyond that, of course, they did prevail in a way in Syria. Of course, the way they prevailed ultimately was they destroyed Aleppo. Again, it was Syrian forces on the ground, though. It was not the Russian forces. They were doing the bombing campaign and some special operations. The same in Grozny. If we remember, that was a long, protracted campaign. There's some real differences here. Number one is just the sheer quality, capability, innovativeness, resourcefulness of not just, again, the Ukrainian soldiers, it's also the partisan units and even the other resistance. This is the equivalent of, the French in World War II, who are just finding every diabolically creative way to make life difficult for the Russians, whether it's jamming their frequencies, changing road signs, or actually picking off the fuel trucks in that 40-mile convoy to exacerbate the logistical challenges that Russia is already experiencing. So again, this is going to be a tremendous showdown in Kyiv. And again, I don't know how long the Russian soldiers can keep at this. If you think of the losses, I mean, they're approaching again, the very high estimate there is starting to approach what we lost in 20 years of combat in Iraq. And I remember how difficult some of those weeks and months were. I can't imagine what the strain must be on the tactical level. Commanders, those above them, and of course they've even lost some multi-starred generals, another one of them just in recent 24 hours or so.
Yeah, it's not going well for them. We'll see how desperate Putin becomes. General David Petraeus, as usual, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate it.
So they fled Kyiv just days before the Russian invasion, but they didn't flee the country. American Joe Reimers and his Ukrainian wife, Dasha, went west to Lviv, where they're now helping refugees find places to stay, and they both joined. Hello to both of you. I'm so glad to see you both. Joe will be speaking, since I understand Dasha's concerned about her English. And please, if you have something to say, Dasha, feel free to jump right in. This is your platform and your time to say whatever you want. So again, we're grateful that you're joining us. Joe, you just got married in June after living in Ukraine for 4 years now. Did you ever imagine something like this would happen?
No, I guess that's one of the big problems like this are always things that happen in other countries. And then I moved to one of those countries, and now we're here. But yeah, and all the reading we did about the first year of marriage wasn't something we were prepared for.
So, Dasha, let's try this. Let's just see. How are you doing?
Depends. Sometimes sad, sometimes angry. We're trying to do something just for not to think about my family all the time, but yeah, we're doing okay here.
I imagine it's tough. Your life has been upended in the last few weeks. Joe, how did you have the foresight to really get out of Kyiv? What happened?
I think, honestly, we can't even really say it was our foresight. We felt like we had the opportunity to go, and the reports were getting more concerning. And, my parents in America, I think, were very concerned about it. And so we still, and also Dasha's family was in Mariupol. Her 13-year-old sister was there, and we were more concerned about what would happen in that part of the country. And so we had an opportunity, we thought, to have her sister come to us so she would be away from anything that might happen there. And so that, and also maybe helping my parents to sleep a little better at night, we decided to come, and now obviously we're thankful that we did.
But do you feel safer there, but it's still, Lviv is, there's trouble there, and you're not in complete safety even there, Joe.
Yeah, that's all a guessing game, and it depends on, what we read. One day I'll be sure that there's no way Putin will try to expand the war this far west in the country. Other days you're not so sure about that, but we feel that we're safe here for now. We feel that we're able to do some important work while we're here, and so for now we've made the decision to stay.
You are both living along with Dasha's sister and brother, 18, and therefore cannot leave the country. I understand that you haven't left Ukraine in part because you want to stay with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So as probably a lot of your viewers know, men from 18 to 60 can't leave the country right now unless they have 3 or more kids, or I think there are some really narrow medical exceptions to that. And so we didn't want to leave him here. With Dasha's family also in Mariupol, we didn't feel right leaving, and then once we got here to Lviv, like I said, we felt like there were things that we could do here, and we felt that the situation here was safe, at least for the time being.
Dasha, how's your family doing?
They are hiding in the church basement for the last 9 days now, and there's no water, gas, electricity in the city. Of course, Russian soldiers won't не пускают в город.
They're not letting them evacuate the city?
Yeah, and also they won't let someone else to bring humanitarian help. So they were prepared for that from what we understand. And they had enough food and water for themselves, but then people started coming to the church, and there are more than 20 of them there now. So we talk rarely. The connection is very bad there. So I don't know.
They didn't evacuate because they had to take care of your grandmother, is that right?
Yeah, their first idea was not to leave because they have to take care of her, and now seems like they found a thing to do there, so they have a lot of people they feel responsible for, and plus now they don't even have the ability to leave, even if they would want to.
How long do you think they can hold out with Joe or Josh? How long do you think they can hold out in hiding under the circumstances?
That's hard for us to know because cell service is so limited there right now. We talked to Dasha's dad very briefly yesterday morning, and that was the first time we'd been able to get any communication from them for about 2.5 days before that. And we also know that when we talk to them, they're doing their best not to scare their children about what the situation is really like there. So we don't know a lot of specifics about how much supplies they have. I remember not this last time, but the time before when we talked to them, Dasha's dad said, you know, we have a better basement than a lot of people here in the city, so we can't complain. And so he's, you know, most of the family is staying there in the basement, but he works with an organization that cares for the elderly and widows in their city, and so he's been going around, from what we understand, to deliver them food and supplies. And from what we understand, he won't leave until all of those women are able to leave, and many of them are, live in their beds. They're not able to walk on their own, so it will take some kind of mass evacuation to get them out, which so far hasn't been possible.
Let's talk a little bit more. If you're looking at my notes, you told my team that almost everyone is involved in the war effort. And our reporters have seen people setting up roadblocks, women making camouflage netting, people taking up arms, even civilians making Molotov cocktails. And I understand that you both have been helping refugees find places to stay. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so when we came here, we were in a situation where we were in a city that we had only traveled to a couple of times briefly and didn't know where to stay. And thankfully we got here early enough that we were kind of able to learn our way around the city a little bit. And Dasha has an aunt and an uncle and cousins who live here, and so she got pretty connected with the community here. And she started doing a lot of things, but one thing she did is she kind of made a directory of places all around Ukraine that are taking in displaced people and refugees, phone numbers they can call, and so started kind of connecting people we know and contacts with people we know in Kyiv or other places in the country who have fled here, and helping them find a place to stay, because as I'm sure you've heard, the western part of the country here is just overwhelmed with displaced people.
Dasha, what do you want people to know about you, your family, your country?
I was thinking about it. It's interesting because you never want to be this person people are watching on TV and competing for, right? And we are the same people. We had normal life here. We were happy, and we just want this to come back. We just want this back. So, I don't know if you can help us somehow. We'll be grateful.
Dasha, Joe, thank you so much. We appreciate it. You guys be safe, okay?
Thank you for having us on.
So a big development this morning in the effort to arm the Ukrainians with fighter jets, MiGs, right here, which they know how to fly. So the Pentagon has rejected a surprise, nuanced offer from Poland. What Poland offered was to fly all of its MiGs from Poland here to a U.S. air base, Ramstein, U.S. NATO air base in Germany, and then have them flown somehow into Ukraine. The Pentagon calls that offer untenable. CNN's Barbara Starr is live at the Pentagon with the latest here. What's going on?
Well, Tom, untenable for the very reasons you just drew on that map. So let's keep the map up. The idea that the Poles surprised the U.S. with late yesterday, fly them to the U.S. air base in Ramstein, Germany. Germany, a NATO country, U.S. a NATO country. And the concern is that if those MiG-29s then flew into Ukraine from essentially what is an air base inside of NATO, the Russians would perceive it as a NATO threat, as NATO becoming involved in the war, and NATO is determined not to become involved in the war unless, of course, it was attacked by Russia. So right now, that idea seems to be something that's been summarily rejected. Of course, Vice President Kamala Harris will talk to the Poles about the idea, see if there's another way around this. They want to get those MiG-29s into Ukraine somehow.
Thing is coming together to isolate Vladimir Putin. There are a lot of innocent Russians who are the victims here, but as long as Russia is waging an invasion and a war against civilians, I think seeking to isolate their economy from the global trading system is the right thing to do. I think seeking to work with others to isolate Russia is the right thing to do. You know, in a real sense, what some have called a holiday from history is probably over for the United States, and we've got much more to worry about in terms of our national security than most Americans realized a year ago. And we're going to have to invest more in our national defense. We're going to need to do more to make sure that our economy can be more self-reliant. We're going to have to engage in alliances, some of which aren't going to be the most comfortable alliances for us. But that's what we do when there are real threats to global security.
Larry Summers, we appreciate you being with us this morning. A sobering discussion, but thank you.
Thank you.
Incredibly, they emerge. Some still standing, some too weak to walk, after more than a week under heavy bombardment in the Kyiv suburb of Irpin. Volunteers help them carry their bags, the final few. But for now, there is no place to lie down. The women are shepherded onto a bus, their arduous journey not over yet. For Larissa and Andrei, the wait is finally over. Their son is alive.
The only words you can tell to the phone, like, "Mom, I'm alive. Mom, I'm alive," and that's it.
I'm the happiest mother in the world right now, she says. My son is with me. But not every mother here is so lucky. For many, the wait continues. Clarissa Ward, CNN.
In one of the best-known theatres in Ukraine's cultural capital, Lviv, no audience to be entertained, rather families seeking shelter from war. We never imagined we would end up living in a theatre, Evgeny tells us. We never imagined leaving our home and fleeing our city. Tamila says she fled Kyiv 2 days ago to get her kids out of danger, leaving her mother and husband behind. Now she contemplates what's to come.
We lived happy and we have plans for future, for locations, for our babies, for studying for our babies, and it was a happy future.
Throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Lviv has been nervous but otherwise an oasis of relative quiet. And that's made the city a destination for those running from where the shells are falling. Most of them are moving on to the border, but more than 200,000 have decided to stay here. Lviv welcoming them, looking after them. But now the city's mayor says Lviv is full and we need help.
This has put a lot of pressure on us and the infrastructure of Lviv. I would like to address international organizations asking for support. We need you now and we need you here.
Andriy Sadavoy is pleading for tents, food, medical supplies. He says more than 400 cultural and educational facilities are being used to house the displaced. Here, a school, a place of learning in normal times, now a place of refuge for families not knowing their next move, other than it won't be going home.
It is difficult to imagine how this craziness began. For the sake of what? For what reason are they killing people? What have we done to deserve this?
Lviv, an historic city in need of help. The impact of this war being felt well away from the front line. Now, if you would like to help people in Ukraine who might be in need of shelter, food and water, go to cnn.com/impact. You'll find several ways there.
At the same time, Scott, I wanted to ask you about the other really terrifying situation that Ukrainian officials are warning about. The concerns at the Chernobyl nuclear site, which has been knocked off the power grid. What are you hearing about this?
Okay, so the Ukrainian nuclear regulator already didn't have access to the remote sensing system or the remote monitoring system. Now, 2 power lines into the Chernobyl plant have been knocked off the grid. Now, the regulator says that those 2 power lines do not connect directly with any safety equipment at the site, which obviously still contains a large amount of nuclear radioactive material. But what that is doing is making it extremely difficult for them to do repairs and do maintenance. There is a backup generator. The foreign minister said that that generator lasted for about 48 hours. Beyond that, there may be difficulties, there may be problems, according to the foreign minister. The other issue at that site, Kate, is the fact that the staff there, which again, the site is under Russian control right now, the staff there have been working for 13 days straight. They are essentially living at the site. And so Ukraine's nuclear regulator, which again is not controlling the site, had some words for the International Atomic Energy Agency, calling on them to do more to convince the Russians to swap out ships, because essentially they are facing psychological pressure and moral exhaustion at this stage. As for that agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they say that when it comes to the power issue, there is no critical impact on safety, at least at this point.
Joining me now is Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program, Jim Walsh. He's in Washington. He's here to help us understand how, Jim, connecting this nuclear power plant from the state power grid might cause a nuclear discharge. Explain, if you will.
Sure. So let's first start with the general principle, which is nuclear power plants, operating nuclear power plants, and the nearby facilities that hold the nuclear waste, the hot waste that has just come out of a working nuclear power plant, they need to maintain a cool temperature. The power plant itself does, and more importantly, because it's more vulnerable, the spent fuel ponds with the hot radioactive waste have to be cooled down. If you lose cooling for either of those, then you're really running the risk of different types of radiation leakage. Now let's talk about Chernobyl. Chernobyl, it's been 30 plus years since that plant had an accident and was shut down. So a lot of that fuel has had 30 plus years to cool down, unlike the fuel that was at that Ukrainian reactor that the Russians attacked early in the invasion, for which there was a fire nearby. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has come out this morning and said, even if Chernobyl, this 30 plus year old plant, were to lose its main power supply, it has a short-term backup power supply for 48 hours or so. But more fundamentally, that the risk of a leak or problems is lower because it's had 30 years to cool down. So the big difference here is Chernobyl's old, and all the other power plants in Ukraine are not that old, as far as having been shut down decades ago. So that danger, less so for Chernobyl, but is certainly a potential danger if currently operating nuclear power plants in Ukraine were to suffer similar problems.
Fascinating. Okay. You've testified before the US Senate and House on issues of nuclear terrorism following your talks with officials in both Iran and in North Korea. How seriously are you taking Vladimir Putin's, let's call them, threats and allusions to a potential nuclear war?
Well, I think you have to take them seriously. I mean, anytime a country goes on nuclear alert, it's a serious matter. Now, over the 7+ decades of the nuclear age, countries have gone on alert, have not fought a second nuclear war. So it's not a guarantee. If you go on alert, it's not automatic that there's going to be a nuclear exchange. But yes, I think this is a real danger. It should remind us what we sort of all forgot about after the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, we all, sighed a sigh of relief. We weren't going to die in a global thermonuclear war. And then we moved on to other things. But while we were moving on to other things, there are another 15,000 nuclear weapons still in the world. Russia owns 45% of those nuclear weapons. They have not gone away. And so that remains a danger. I mean, the Washington Post had a headline the other day, and I think said it well, which is Russia reminds us why we need to finish the unfinished business of nuclear arms control, because it just takes one bad leader, one bad miscalculation. You could end up in a very, very horrific place, far beyond what we are seeing on the ground right now.
After months of waiting and pleading for a meeting with the White House, the family of an American detained in Russia since 2019 finally received a call from President Biden, a call that they'd been praying for. Joey and Paula Reed, the parents of former U.S. Marine Trevor Reed, were staking out the president's motorcade route during his trip to Fort Worth, Texas, not too far from their home. And they were holding signs about their son, and the motorcade passed them without stopping. But then their phone rang with a number that said the White House. Listen.
And I just can't imagine what you're going through. And look, going through is hell. I don't want you to think it's not something that I constantly think about.
Joining us now to tell us about their phone call with the president are Trevor's parents, Paula and Joey Reed. The Dallas Morning News reported that he appeared to acknowledge you with a gesture, that he seemed to have seen you from the motorcade. Paula, tell us about this phone call and what it meant to you.
It was great. It was everything we could have hoped for. We thought with just the acknowledgement on the way in to the motorcade that I felt, okay, he at least saw me and I felt validated by that. But then when he called, he put it over the top. It was just great.
Joey?
Yeah, we had, we just wanted to, yesterday, we wanted to get some media attention for our son and hopefully set up a meeting with the president, which they had already said on Air Force One on the way in that they were planning on having some sort of meeting with us, but he confirmed that directly, and the phone call we received from President Biden is exactly how you want a president to be, and we're very thankful.
So, I mean, Joey, he was very compassionate. He was very sympathetic to what you're going through. What else did he tell you?
Well, we want to reiterate that we've always said that we believe President Biden is probably one of the most compassionate, caring presidents we've had in modern times. But he just reinforced that he's always thinking about Trevor, and that, we talked briefly about his son and why he couldn't stop in the motorcade. And the Secret Service frowns upon it when they have a large convoy. And and then the thing that really kind of put it over the top for us was he said he prays for our son every day, and that he had said a rosary before he came to Fort Worth for our son.
Paula, you've been fighting for so long to try to get Trevor home, and more people are paying attention now. They're watching Russia. They're seeing this war happening. What has been going through your mind as this war has been going on?
Well, it's kind of double-edged for me because finally we're getting the media attention that we deserve, and like you said, the attention from the world in general. But it comes at a horrible price. We feel horrible for the Ukrainian people and the Russian people who don't want to be in a war. And then also we had some more publicity after Brittany Griner got arrested, and we feel sorry for her and her family.
Yeah, certainly. And I think she's elevated certainly Trevor's case as well, with now being in detention herself. So I know, Joey, you hadn't spoken to Trevor in a very long time. Then out of the blue, he's actually called you a few times on Friday and yesterday. Can you tell us about that? Tell us how he sounds.
Yeah, we hadn't heard from him in 232 days until this past Friday. Then he was able to call us again on Monday, and then he called us again this morning. He's been sounding horrible. He's coughing constantly. He said he's coughing up blood throughout the day. He has fever off and on, over 100 degrees, and he has pain in his chest. Just all the signs of tuberculosis, which we're afraid he's contracted. And then we had even worse news this morning. He called and he could barely talk. He's some sort of accident, and he believes he might have broken a rib. So now as he's coughing, he has shooting, stabbing pains in his chest.
Every time he coughs.
So they said that they'll send him to a hospital prison to be checked on Friday. So again, it just seems to be getting worse and worse.
Paula, what kind of accident? I mean, did he shed any light on that?
I think he said something fell on him from a shelf, and he was immediately felt pain after occurred.
Yeah, another strange update is that, in the last 3 weeks, they've not put him in solitary confinement, where he's been for most of the last 7 months. So he's in a regular barracks right now. And something happened there. He said something fell on him, and he's hurt. His chest is hurting in a different way now.
Do you think he can be honest with you? Do you think he can be fully honest with you, Paula, about what's going on with him and his health?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Well, I'm not.
You don't.
totally
I guess
sure of that.
that's my question. I think, Joey, is do you have reason to believe that it's something other than something fell on him?
I don't, but you have to always leave that open. His calls are monitored, and sometimes there might be. I'm not sure there's someone with him, but there could be. For the most part, he's pretty open in what he says. He's not concerned about going into solitary confinement. That's for sure.
Yeah. Look, the last time we spoke with you guys, we said, "What would you say to Trevor?" And here you've had this chance to tell him. What did you say to him, Paula, after so many days of not being able to speak with him?
Well, we told him the good news that we had gone to the event yesterday and that President Biden waved to us, and then he actually called us, and he said he was very excited for us, but he's still cautiously optimistic. I think that's the best way he can cope with things. I think he doesn't want to get his hopes up too much. So for him, it works better if he just kind of downplays everything, but he could tell that we were very excited.
Joey, does he understand what's going on? I mean, how much were you able to fill him in and tell him what's happening with the war and how much pressure Russia's under?
Yeah, surprisingly, they are not censoring what he says to us. So he's telling us what they're hearing there in the barracks from Russian TV, or there's a TV somewhere where they're getting information. And, they're getting a completely different story. In fact, when he called Monday, the news they're getting is that Ukraine was all but conquered. Russia had covered most of Ukraine already. And so and then he says, what's actually going on? And then we try and fill him in, and he's like, oh, wow, that's not at all what we're hearing here.
What was his reaction to learning that? When you said to him, actually, Ukraine, the expectation was that it would topple, and yet the resistance is incredible, and Russia's, really kind of on its heels or flat-footed here. What did he say to that?
Well, he didn't say this, but I can speak for him. If the Russian government speaks, you should pretty much consider that it's false or largely false.
And he had a little chuckle, I think, right when we first told him to.
Well, it must have been amazing for him to hear your voices after so long and for you to hear his. And I just can't imagine how much that buoyed him to be able to talk to you guys. And I thank you so much. Thank you for telling us about your conversations with him and about the president, Paul and Joey. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Of course.
A defiant Volodymyr Zelensky receiving multiple standing ovations from the British House of Commons.
We will not give up, and we will not lose. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, on the streets.
Zelensky likely reminding his audience of the wartime inspirations of Winston Churchill, who addressed the same body after the evacuation of Dunkirk.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Of course, he's definitely trying to channel Winston Churchill. I mean, one thing that's very important to remember about Zelensky is a performer.
Zelensky's use of social media and other platforms has allowed him to dominate the information war. From his interview with CNN's Matthew Chance from his bunker.
Everybody has to stop fighting.
To a defiant address from behind his desk on Monday, the first time he was seen there since the invasion began.
I'm staying in Kyiv, in my office. I'm not hiding, and I'm not afraid of anyone.
To a video posted on Facebook from the streets of Kyiv with his cabinet on the second night of the invasion, delivering a similar message.
The president is here. We are all here. Our military are here.
Analysts say there's no doubt Zelensky's almost daily messages have stiffened the backbone of the Ukrainian military and its citizens, and have even resonated inside his enemies' borders.
Some of his recent video messages, it must be said, have been quite powerful, including the message to the Russian people that he gave, where he basically called on them to resist this war, which was quite emotional.
The images of Zelensky meeting with his troops as they prepared for battle, of selfie videos posted from the streets.
This is our land, our country, and we are defending all of it.
These are products, analysts say, of a leadership team which knows how to connect with younger audiences.
They're very in tune with that younger generation. These guys really master social media in a way that has been very effective.
Contrast that with the autocrat in the Kremlin, who sits distanced from aides at long tables and whose messages to his country seem increasingly disconnected.
He appears fearful. You just get the sense of a man alone. Whereas Zelensky is among his people, among his team, and in the fight.
All of which means that if Zelensky is killed, imprisoned, or driven out, the loss of those messages would be devastating for Ukrainians. Analysts point out there are other Ukrainian leaders who could take up the slack, like former President Petro Poroshenko or Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, who have been bravely transmitting messages from the streets. But it's unlikely they would have the resonance of Volodymyr Zelensky. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
It was really an amazing moment, right? This was President Zelensky speaking to the British House of Commons yesterday, and he seemed to evoke Winston Churchill.
We will not give up and we will not lose. We will fight till the end at sea, in the air. We will continue fighting for our land, whatever the cost. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets.
That is no accident.
No, not at all. That is an intentional, direct echo of Churchill's famous speech from June 4th, 1940, "We will fight them on the beaches, we shall never surrender." And that's why it was greeted with a standing ovation in British Parliament. Zelensky's speeches have been able to inspire and change policy when it comes to speaking to people in the West. And one of the big questions at the outset of this, I think, for a lot of folks was, is Zelensky a former comedian, actor? Is he going to be Ashraf Ghani, or is he going to be Winston Churchill? We now know the answer. He's going to be Winston Churchill.
And he's drawn the people together in a way that stiffens their spine. Now, I know that a lot of foreign diplomats would like him to leave, but they now understand he's not leaving Kyiv, and if he is assassinated by the Russians in the process, he becomes a martyr, and that continues to draw the Ukrainian people together. As one diplomat told me, he becomes the most famous Ukrainian of all time.
He's almost single-handedly, I think, especially because he's evoking so much World War II through so much of what he's saying, John. He's almost single-handedly making people, Western allies, wonder, oh my God, is this the sort of the beginning of a World War III? And if it is, and whatever comes after this, what are we going to do right now? Right? He's sort of a reckoning that he's creating.
Well, look, I mean, I think one of the things that this invasion has made us realize is that many of us took the peace created after the Second World War for granted. The liberal international order that was established by America and its allies, and it is a rules-based society. That's what Vladimir Putin is directly attacking, as well as the people of Ukraine. And we are confronting that every day. It has caused us to double down on our defense of these alliances. That NATO and the Western world is more united now because we're not taking this for granted because of Vladimir Putin's aggression. And Zelensky is in a position to highlight that. So yes, I think we realize now why these institutions were created, why they need to be defended, why we need to defend the liberal democratic order. Because of things like this. Because the alternative is people who believe that might makes right. People who believe they can lie to their people and rule by force and murder to get their way. And we cannot allow that to be the trajectory of the 21st century.
Yeah, I think there was also this thought in World War II, oh, they'll just stop at Poland, right?
Yeah.
And people wonder, oh, will he really just stop it at Ukraine? You know, like what comes after this? Yeah. Kim, John, thank you so much for the discussion. Really appreciate it.
Following, continuing to follow the breaking news that we're going to show you here. These are the first images coming in of what Ukraine says was a Russian bombing of a maternity hospital and children's ward in the southern port city of Mariupol. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that there are children under the rubble. There are no known military targets anywhere near this hospital. We've got a lot to discuss here. Joining me right now is CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Clayton. Also with us, Ann Applebaum. She's a writer for The Atlantic. Thank you both so much for being here. I want to go straight to a map. I want to show everyone, just to remind everyone, Colonel, right here you see where Mariupol is. It's a key port city in the southern part of the country. It's been under siege for days, Colonel. Why would a hospital be a target of an airstrike? What is the objective?
Oh, it certainly should not be the airstrike because that is an area that is absolutely prohibited under international law. So it should be off the table completely. Now, the object of this, unfortunately, is terrorizing the civilian population. These kinds of attacks are typical, unfortunately, of what the Russians have been doing, and this is another example of proven that there is absolutely no way in which the Russians are following standard targeting procedures in this war.
And what we're showing right now, and you might not be able to see it, this is brand new video. I'm seeing it for the first time along with you, of a different perspective from outside of what looks like a very large complex. You can see smoke billowing, a completely bombed out car. It is completely and utterly devastated from what we can see. It's shocking that that building is even still standing as I'm looking at this. And Putin is now hit apartment buildings, hospitals, a maternity ward, a children's ward. What should that tell everyone about Russia's plan?
So Putin's initial plan was to occupy Ukraine quickly, take over the government, and declare that the country was now part of Russia. That failed completely. He had no idea that the Ukrainians would resist the way that they have. What he's doing now is really a policy of terror. He's trying to terrorize the population. He's trying to make people leave. He may be hoping to take over empty cities and then claim those or populate them with Russians. What he's really doing is a form of ethnic cleansing. The idea is to get rid of the population, replace them, get them away, murder them if necessary, or scare them. It's a policy that the Russians have used before. They used it in Chechnya, and they used it in Syria, where they also were known to actively target hospitals. They would get the coordinates of the hospitals from the UN and then target them on purpose. So this is a long-standing Russian tactic. We recognize it, and we should know it for what it is.
I want to do, before we move on to the next map, Colonel, actually what Anne's saying is something I've heard from other military men and women, which is this isn't just a Putin playbook. This is a Russia playbook. This is a Soviet playbook, and civilians are just pawns in it. Is that what we're seeing here? I mean, I know, Colonel, you can see what we're looking with this new video from outside this hospital, which is, I can only hope that this hospital was evacuated, but President Zelensky says there are children in the room.
Kate, I'm afraid President Zelensky is probably right, and is absolutely right. This is ethnic cleansing at its worst, and it is also part of the Russian playbook. Go back all the way, you can go back way in history, but go back to World War II, go back to Chechnya, go back to any of these conflicts that Russia's been involved in. This is exactly what they do, and it is a complete violation of international law and standard wartime procedures.
All right, I want to turn now, as we're waiting for more details on this, I want to turn now to new CNN reporting from the Pentagon, which is more troops, more weapons, more assets, all headed to bolster the eastern flank of NATO. You see all of these countries in blue. This is where more assets are heading, coming from our Pentagon unit in their new reporting. And I want to read for you, Colonel, just some of the details here. Patriot missiles to Poland. The Army's 5th Corps also deploying 300 headquarters troops to Poland and Germany to provide command and control for U.S. ground forces. Air Support Operations Center heading to Poland and Romania, refueling and maintenance specialists to Germany, and now it would be a total of 100,000 U.S. troops expected in Europe. What sticks out to you here when you hear all of this manpower and firepower heading over there?
Okay, what we're looking at is a deployment that's basically what we're doing here. We're doing this as a preventive measure to warn Putin that if he moves one step into a NATO country, that we will respond to that using Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So that is what we're seeing. It's somewhat similar to what we did in the Middle East in the run-up to the first Gulf War and as well as the second Gulf War. And that is what is part of the U.S. playbook when it comes to these kinds of operations. Standard operating procedure, lots of folks going over, and it's something that will probably be an operation that we'll have to sustain for some time.
You know, Anne, one of Putin's original and longtime goals was to push away and weaken NATO. And if we can put the map back up, guys, beside me, because I want to just go back to it. The opposite seems to be happening here to this map. Thank you very much, Rob. As you see NATO allies, you see where they stand in comparison to Russia and why Ukraine is obviously in the center of it. This is just reinforcing exactly what Putin has not wanted. Was this a major miscalculation on his part? Because the opposite is happening from his original and longtime goal here. How does he react to this?
Yes, I think Putin was listening to Trump's enunciations of NATO and his distance from NATO during that administration, and he was following the divisions that kind of rhetoric created, and he imagined that NATO was now permanently divided and would never be able to reunite again. I think he didn't count on what the sight of tanks rolling across a European country would do to people in Germany, people in Italy, people in France, people in Europe, and of course people in the United States. It reminds everybody of a part of the European past that we all hoped would never come back, and of course that NATO was created to prevent. And so you have seen a really remarkable shift all across Europe as Europeans do now what should have really been done some months ago, which is to reinforce and rearm Ukraine.
Today, Vladimir Putin's Ukraine invasion is 2 weeks old. The Kremlin marking it by accusing the United States of waging economic war against Russia. Punishing global sanctions have pushed Putin to sign emergency measures to boost his failing economy. But there's little confidence among American officials that pressuring the Russian president will deter him. To the contrary, U.S. intelligence assesses the more isolated Putin is, the more likely he is to unleash more indiscriminate bombing. During our conversation with Ian Bremmer, he's the president of the Eurasia Group, also the author of the forthcoming book, The Power of Crisis. Ian Bremmer, grateful for your time today, but it is a sad day. We are watching the aftermath of according to the Ukrainians, Russian airstrike on a children's hospital, a maternity ward in Mariupol. This has been one of the things that many people have feared. You have studied Vladimir Putin a long time, that a logical person 2 weeks in, things aren't going well, might reassess. Instead, the fear is that we'll have this, more indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, pretty much any scenario we look at shows that Putin is going to end up in a materially worse position, both in terms of his own domestic political environment, certainly in terms of Russia's economy, and perhaps most importantly for Putin, if you look at his European security environment, which is ostensibly the reason he invaded Ukraine to begin with, he's going to be much worse off than he was before he invaded, and that makes it harder to find any way for him to climb down, at least until he can credibly make the argument to his people, I've accomplished X, Y, and Z. And right now, he's not there. And until Kiev is taken, until Zelensky is removed from office, it is really hard to imagine a climb down from Putin. And I wish the news were better, but right now I don't see it.
And so let's listen to the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, on the point you make right here. Where, how, is there an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin?
The way this conflict will end is when Putin realizes that this adventure has put his own leadership standing at risk with his own military, with his own people, and he will have to change course, or the Russian people take matters into their own hands.
But is that not the Putin paradox, if you will, in that things are going horribly for him? He is isolated globally from an economic standpoint. He has, as you noted, the opposite of what he wanted. More NATO troops, more U.S. troops, an emboldened Europe standing up against him. And now the military campaign is not going as well. Again, a logical person would say maybe it's time to stand down. Vladimir Putin does the opposite.
Well, it's interesting because Victoria Nuland's point, if you read it from the Russian perspective, would be, you see, what the Americans and the Europeans are doing is they're trying to destroy the Russian economy to bring about regime change. That's what they really want here. And the way the Russians read that is it's economic warfare. So we need to retaliate against NATO. We need to engage in cyber attacks. We need to engage in asymmetric attacks. We need to find ways to hurt their economy. It's not going to be enough for us to just sit on Ukraine. So, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I understand that we want to punish the Russians for the unconscionable decision to invade an independent country of 44 million people. But the Russians do see this as acts of warfare, and they are in a position to retaliate.
I want you to listen here to Vladimir Putin, because every day we try to figure out, is he thinking differently today than he was yesterday? This is an address to the Russian people where he does acknowledge things are not perfect.
I would like to address the mothers, wives, sisters, brides, and girlfriends of our soldiers and officers who are now in battle defending Russia during a special military operation. I understand how you worry about your loved ones. You can be proud of them, just as the whole country is proud of them and worries about them together with you. Let me emphasize that military conscripts do not and will not participate in hostilities. There will be no additional call-ups of reservists from the reserve.
We know, Ian Bremer, there are conscripts in Ukraine, so we know that Putin lies, frankly. But do you read any significance into the fact that he does feel compelled to address casualties on national television?
Of course, and the fact is they're not just casualties, but they're casualties in the service of killing brother and sister Slavs in Ukraine. This is not like the war in Grozny and Chechnya. It's not like the war in Afghanistan. I mean, there are a lot of Russians that are going to feel very uncomfortable and don't know what the war's for when it's Russian against Ukrainian. But I have to recognize as well, in the same way that Zelensky has become a hero for the West in the past 2 weeks of fighting, in the same way that the Ukrainians are winning the information war around the world, Putin is winning it in Russia. And a majority of Russians believe, falsely, that the Ukrainians have committed acts of genocide against Russians in occupied Donbass. They believe falsely that the Russians are forced into this war because of aggressive actions by the Ukrainians and NATO. And if the Russians take casualties, as they take casualties, as the Russian economy gets crippled, they blame NATO for that. And they're with Putin. And that's a very serious problem for the West to overcome, the fact that Putin has so much control of the information space inside of Russia.
Ian Bremer, great important insights. All the evidence before us tells us we'll be after some time.
We're getting powerfully reactive to the bombing at Children's Hospital in southern Ukraine. President Zelensky claiming just a little while ago that the attack is proof, his word, proof, that genocide is happening in Ukraine. And he's doubling down on his accusation that Russia is committing war crimes. CNN senior international correspondent Sam Kiley is in the region for us, Sam, even after everything we've seen so far in this brutal war. This bombing certainly stands out as especially ruthless.
Yes, Wolf, a new low, but not an unpredictable low. If we look at the possible disregard of civilian life that the Russians have shown so far, and if we look at the record of Vladimir Putin, of course, particularly in Syria, where there was deliberate targeting of hospitals by Russian aircraft throughout his support there of President Assad. So he's got form for this sort of attack, but even by his standards, it's a new low. This is what it looked like.
We're really stretched. Whatever cars you have, send them here. He says airstrike, a maternity hospital. This was Russia's response to a global appeal for a ceasefire to evacuate a city of 1 million people. A bomb dropped next to a maternity hospital in Mariupol. It's hospital number 3. Inside, a frantic search for survivors. Early reports say that there were more than a dozen injured. A miraculous outcome to an attempt to a mass killing at a place where lives should begin. Many women and children have already fled to underground bunkers after a week of Russian bombardment. Ukraine's president renewed his pleas for NATO to drive Russia from his nation's skies after the hospital airstrike.
Everything that the occupiers do with Mariupol is already beyond trust.
Europeans, Ukrainians, citizens of Mariupol, today, we must be united in condemning this war crime of Russia.
Evacuations from other towns have been more successful, but still very limited. Around 700 people, mostly women and children, were bussed out of Energoda, the site of Europe's biggest nuclear reactor, which was captured recently by Russia.
The shops are empty. There's nothing there. Not enough medical supplies. We're tired. We need to eat and rest.
It may seem extraordinary, but these are the lucky ones. They've escaped from the shadow of a nuclear power station and the clutches of Russian troops. But in comparison to what people are enduring in Mariupol, this is good fortune. Yulia Karyula volunteers at a refugee center in Zaporizhia, set up to receive people fleeing her hometown of Mariupol. It's empty. She's been waiting a week for news from home of her husband Evgeny and daughter Yasia. This morning, a brief call. How's your daughter doing?
My daughter told me she loves me.
Of course she does.
Actually, how she's alive, she's doing like all of the children doing now in Mariupol, almost no drinking water, no electricity. It was -5 this night. They have no heating. They just sit in a cold basement in some pots.
Her small family is living in a bomb shelter with hundreds of others. She says they can only survive another few days. Then they will have to surface, perhaps to face more of this.
Now, Wolf, of course, the term genocide is much overused. It's a sign, really, of the rhetorical passion that the president feels, because he feels so abandoned by the international community over what he said is that they have to impose no crimes and prevent these sorts of continued atrocities and war crimes being committed with. But, of course, NATO's fear is very clearly stated, is that if they get involved, that could lead to something far more catastrophic.
Sam Kiley on the scene for us. Sam, thank you for that report. Stay safe over there, please. Let's go to Ukrainian capital Kyiv right now, where air raid sirens sounded just a short while ago. Our chief international correspondent, Melissa Gordon's airport. Melissa, you've been reporting on the devastating toll facing Ukrainians after the strike on the hospital. Is there any doubt that Putin is actually targeting civilians?
Well, I think it's always really difficult to differentiate between actively targeting civilians and having a complete disregard for the lives of civilians. But certainly, when you look at some of the places that have been hit in the bombardment over the last week, particularly evacuation routes where civilians were trying to flee to safety, apartment buildings, residential buildings where people were just living with their families. And what's very interesting and very telling and crucially important about this Mariupol maternity hospital is that several hours before this attack took place, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, warned that, in her words, Ukrainian forces were using the hospital complex as a sort of launch pad for military activity. And she claimed at that moment that all staff and patients had been evacuated from that hospital in order to facilitate that military activity. Now, when you look at these images, Wolf, you can see very clearly that there are staff members, that there are patients, that there are children, that there are heavily pregnant women who have just given birth, who are bloodied and injured and cut up and having their wounds assisted. So it appears in this case that the Russians understood that this was a hospital, and it becomes very difficult to believe that they actually really genuinely thought that there were no patients and no staff inside that complex being treated. Ultimately, as the mayor of Mariupol said, these are crimes that will have to go to The Hague, potentially to the International Criminal Court to decide. But as Sam pointed out as well in his reporting, we have seen this before, in Syria particularly, where we know concretely that Russian forces were actively targeting hospitals.
Clarissa, Mariupol, the city where this attack took place, was supposed to be under a ceasefire so that civilians could actually escape. Are any of these 5 so-called humanitarian corridors actually really safe?
Really safe is a difficult term to sort of categorize exactly, Wolf. I will say that here in Kyiv today, in the suburbs, which have been so hard hit, roughly 3,000 people, according to Ukrainian authorities and local officials here in Kyiv, were able to get out of some of those hardest hit areas. And there were reports that the bombardment in those areas was a little bit less than it had been before. We also heard that quite a few people were able to escape the northern city of Sumy. Again, that has been the site of just some truly horrific bombardment. But if you look at the sort of broader picture, and you look at Mariupol in particular, for 3 straight days that they have tried desperately to get out, to get humanitarian aid in. Shelling continues, the bombing continues, and I don't think anyone can call it a true ceasefire.
Yeah, very excited, at least right now. Clarissa Ward, be careful over there as well. Clarissa's in Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital.
I want to get perspective now what we have seen today and this past 2 weeks, and what we may see tomorrow. David Remnick, in addition to being editor of The New Yorker, he's also the author of 6 books, including the indispensable Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire. So, David, you hear about this meeting, talk about this meeting tomorrow between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, there has, we've seen some evidence of corridors that have been open. We've seen other violations of that, both sides blaming each other for that. Is there any evidence that you see that Vladimir Putin wants an end to this war at this point?
Not yet. I mean, let's stipulate that this is an invasion of a sovereign country for no reason at all. It's merciless, disgusting, and brutal. So that's the thing that's most obvious. And yet we're in a situation where we don't want it to escalate to the point where Ukraine is decimated and just endless casualties and a refugee crisis that destabilizes Europe for the rest of our lives. We don't want to see that. And, the ancient philosopher of war, Sun Tzu, once said that you need to build a golden bridge for your opponent, for your enemy, so that he can walk across it and retreat. And somehow, some way, Ukraine is going to have to devise, and above all Ukraine, the West can't do it for Ukraine, some sense of what can be conceded, as painful and horrible and unjust as it is, so that there's a negotiated settlement, so that this insane war, instigated solely by Vladimir Putin, can end, and the bloodshed can end, and these concessions would be enormously painful, whether it's recognizing Crimea finally as Russian territory or some settlement in the eastern Ukraine. I totally recognize this is sovereign Ukrainian territory, but there's no sign that Putin is just because he suffered some military losses in some parts of the country, he's just really retreat. That's not him. That's not his history. He wasn't engrossing.
Yeah. And I mean, you've certainly seen, people seen what the Russian military is capable of doing in Aleppo, Syria, leveling installing a thug as the leader there. Have you been surprised at the performance of the Russian military?
Well, I think Putin is surprised at the performance of the Russian military. What happens in the authoritarian regime, and Putin's regime is something that abnormal, it's part of year after year, it becomes increasingly isolated. It begins to believe its own nonsense. Fewer and fewer people come to the best contrary information. And he clearly thought he could waltz into Ukraine in a few days' time with an install puppet regime, or have them just give up. And Ukraine has proved itself under the leadership of Zelensky and just the sheer bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people. They have proved themselves capable, at least until now, of fending off the Russians. But let's not be deluded. Let's not be deluded. Yes, the attack on Kiev has been stalled, but Russia, through sheer brutalism, is making enormous gains in the south along the Black Sea. And, given time, time is unfortunately on Russia's side. in this military game because there is not going to be a no-fly zone. There's not going to be a defense in the standard sense of NATO coming to its rescue as if it were an Article 5 country. And it will get as horrible as the news was. It will multiply and get much worse. That's who Vladimir Putin is. That's who he's been for a very long time.
I spoke to former CNN Moscow bureau chief Joel Brody in the last hour, talked about the new Russian law criminalizing independent journalism.
At your service.
It is, I mean, this desire of Vladimir Putin to suppress accurate reporting about the war, you know, Orwellian not using the word war, you can't use the word invasion. What does it say to you about how he views his own grip on power right now, about his position now?
Well, a despot's grip on power is always innately unstable. It's always threatened from below, which Putin has always recognized. He's looked around the world and seen what's happened in the Arab world some years ago. He's seen
been leveled, and she witnessed a family being shot before her eyes. When she thinks of the man responsible for raining down bombs and bullets on her beloved country, her tears turn to rage.
Putin – это второй Гитлер.
Putin is the second Hitler. It is serious. If the world doesn't stop him, there will be World War III.
Putin has said that he is going into Ukraine to kill Nazis. You are saying that Putin is, in your mind, the new Hitler.
Yes, it is obvious now that he is not fighting Nazis. While they are all grateful to escape to Poland, the children and adults all say they want one thing: to be able to cross the border home to a safe Ukraine. And I should mention that now the number of refugees in total that have come over the Polish border from Ukraine is now up to 1.3 million people. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Przemysl, Poland.
Hey, sir. Hey, man. Do me a favor, man. Come this way. Put your hand behind your back.
Hands down my back. Okay. Got it. You got it.
204, whatever you say.
Fellas, I really should do it.
What's going on, my man?
Trying to put money on my own.
You said what? Yeah, this your phone?
Yeah, sure.
Good job, man.
And I said, how can I help you? He said, look at the note. And the note said, I want to withdraw 12,000 Beavis Street. So I said, you want to make a withdrawal? He told me which account. He said, he just kept putting, he was like, look at the note. So I'm like, okay. He did give me his ID. It was a California ID. But my stomach started turning. Like, I'm like, okay, it just seems odd because you're making a withdrawal, but you can't get a note on the back of the deposit slip. And you keep telling me, look at the note, but you don't want to talk to me.
I stated to the officers that arrested me that had their Glocks off. So I was putting money on my own account.
I understand.
I put my own bank card in there and put it like you in the back. You know what I'm saying?
So we have to confirm that. You gotta understand. We don't come out because of the seriousness of the call. We don't just come out, and unfortunately, in a situation like that, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. We detain and then we have questions later. That's exactly what I went inside for.
Big inflation report out from the government today. Consumer price index up 7.9% over the last year. That is a pace not seen since January 1982, 40 years ago. Driving that surge? prices for gas, food, and housing. Food prices alone rose 1% last month. That's the largest monthly increase since April 2020. It comes, of course, on the back of rising energy costs, which have spiked further since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. CNN business reporter Matt Egan joins us now for the context. Matt, what do we learn from this?
Well, John, inflation is clearly moving in the wrong direction, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is only going to make it worse. As you mentioned, a 40-year high for headline inflation. We've seen record price increases in February for everything from breakfast sausage and lunch meat, to chicken, baby food, new cars and trucks, men's apparel. It really is across the board. And we know that inflation was very high heading into this period. A lot of that has to do with COVID disruptions and the economic recovery from COVID. And now you have this situation in Ukraine. Russia is an energy powerhouse. It was the number 2 producer of oil in the world last year. We've seen oil prices skyrocket. Gasoline prices have gone up to record highs. They're probably not done rising just yet. And so that means that inflation is only going to get worse, most likely, in March. A lot of those price increases that have been driven by Russia-Ukraine are not even captured in the numbers that came out today, which really only cover February. So we know that inflation is a big issue for the U.S. economy, and it's easy to see how that's going to continue. The question is, what is Washington going to do about it? Next week, the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates for the first time in years, and that will be the first real concrete step from Washington aimed at addressing high inflation, John.
And to the point of what comes next, Matt, you say indications are it's not going to go away quickly. Obviously, the American people paying these higher prices want to know when. A president of the United States whose party has a big election year coming up this year wants to know when. Any indications that it will at least get better, or do we not know?
We don't know. I think that if anything, the past year on the inflation front shows how hard it is to accurately forecast anything about the COVID economy. Remember, last spring, consumer prices were rising, and there was a big debate. Larry Summers on one side, the White House on the other, about how long inflation would be here. And a lot of people have been very surprised by how high inflation has been here and how long it's been here. And then you have this situation with Russia invading Ukraine, this sort of black swan event, and that has just added even more uncertainty to the inflation situation. Now, the job of the Fed here is to try to raise interest rates without short-circuiting this economic recovery. They don't want to do too little because that means inflation could get too hot, and they don't want to do too much because that could actually hurt the economy. This is going to be a very delicate task here on the inflation.
CNN's Vanessa Mercade, which is at a gas station in New York City. What are you hearing there from drivers?
Well, terrible is how one woman described the rising prices to me earlier today. $4.32 a gallon. That is a record today, up 7 cents. As you mentioned, overnight, up almost 80 cents since the beginning of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And this is coming on top of inflation that was already pushing gas prices higher. We spoke to one small business owner, a driver in California. That's the state with the highest gas prices in the country. He says that he drives 450 miles a week for work. He says that the higher prices he's paying at the pump is affecting all of his expenses.
We're hitting close to about $2,300 over budget on things that we never thought we had to even worry about, on gas and travel and couriers and stuff.
Now, a new AAA study out this morning reveals that 60% of Americans said that they would change their driving habits, so either carpooling or cutting back on driving, if gas reaches over $4 a gallon. We are there. And 75% of Americans in the survey said that they would change their driving habits if we saw gas over $5 a gallon. Analysts are expecting that we could reach $5 a gallon nationwide in the next month or so. So with inflation, the summer driving season, and what is happening in Ukraine, Anna, it could be a very pricey couple of months for Americans at the pump.
John, what are you hearing there about yet another sign that inflation isn't going away yet?
The White House had expected this number. Jen Psaki signaled it from the briefing podium the other day. And this is a complication, of course, for the White House, which has been hoping that inflation would moderate over the course of 2022 as we get closer to midterm elections. It's the negative spot in an otherwise bright economic picture, lots of job growth, low unemployment, strong economic growth. But what we're seeing here is continued effects of the pandemic, and you've had a situation where it's partly the result of supply chains as the economy starts back up, demand fueled by all the fiscal relief that the U.S. government and the Biden administration supported for households. That has strained those supply chains even further. But going forward, you mentioned that this number came before the advent of the war. That's going to be a challenge through the course of the year. If gas prices stay high, that makes inflation high. It also complicates the picture for the Federal Reserve, which is trying to manage a reduction of inflation without causing a recession. The recession risk has risen as a result of the pandemic because higher gas prices, higher energy prices, higher commodity prices overall are going to put a strain on the economy. So you've got a very mixed economic picture, good on the employment side, good on the economic growth side, but a real danger for inflation. And economists still expect it to moderate over the course of the year, but that outlook has gotten cloudier as a result of this war, Kate.
Joining me now for more is CNN Business Editor-at-Large and the host of Quest Means Business, Richard Quest. So, Richard, can you give us some of your context here? I mean, what does this level of inflation mean now that it has lasted much longer than the administration had predicted?
The serious very is that inflation becomes entrenched. And once it's become entrenched, it starts receding through the wider economy. For instance, people want higher wages, contractors want higher fees. Everybody's bill goes up, and as those bills go up, so everybody asks for more wages. It's a spiral, and that's what the Fed had hoped to get ahead. Now, bearing in mind, the Fed was already behind the curve. For good reasons. They wanted to make sure that the pandemic effect had gone in terms of the economy. However, by being behind the curve, they were slow to raise rates, which they're still expected to do in March. And now, of course, the unknowns. And remember, it's always the unknowns that get you. The exogenous events, like this war, now entrench inflation and likely to keep it high for the foreseeable future.
The Democrats are now controlled by the Jihad Squad, led by AOC, the little communist from New York City.
Hey all, I'm John Avlon, and this is Reality Check on the extremist beat. Can Trumppublicans please stop calling everyone they disagree with a communist? Seriously. Because it's become the go-to fear-mongering bumper sticker, sliding from liberalism to socialism to communism, with such ignorant ease that it loses all meaning with misuse. Take a listen to some choice cuts and you'll see what I mean.
We all know that AOC and this crowd are a bunch of communists.
And don't ask me to get inside the mind of a liberal, progressive, socialist Marxist like President Biden.
They call it progressivism or something. That's just a new word for socialism and communism.
The direction our country is going in, we all know, is very dangerous. We are walking down a road that is very near socialism. They are trying to turn this country into a communist ash heap.
You cannot be the leader of a free world if you want to appease socialism and communism.
Those are current members of Congress, Republican senators, members of the House of Representatives. There's a lot of reasons why that sickening trend is worth calling out. Mostly because it's massively disrespectful to the millions of people who were murdered by communist regimes over the past 100 or so years, from Lenin to Stalin to Mao and Pol Pot. It's a murderous legacy. And using it as a casual political punchline only shows that you're not serious about communism, let alone common sense. Because there's just no comparison between people you disagree with politically in America and real communism. Somehow that term gets a pass, where, say, Nazi comparisons are generally widely and rightly condemned. Although it's worth noting that some of the folks in that video are also among the first to compare Democratic policies to the Nazis.
You know, Nazis were the National Socialist Party. just like the Democrats are now a National Socialist Party.
This shows they're playing Mad Libs with murderous ideology. And this isn't just historic ignorance. Communist regimes still exist in places like China, Cuba, and North Korea, although they've basically blended with every other autocratic regime that uses ideology as an excuse for kleptocracy. And while we're at it, let's take on that whole socialism attack from which this spread. Because while there are a handful of high-profile, self-identified Democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders and AOC in today's Democratic Party, Democrats in general don't remotely back the state ownership of private enterprise and the abolition of private property, which is the dictionary definition of socialism. And of course, massively popular policies from Social Security to Medicare to Medicaid have been called socialism in the past.
This is not about infrastructure. This is about paving a path to socialism. This is about expanding the government in the most dramatic fashion since the New Deal.
Somebody should tell Senator Lindsey Graham that infrastructure spending isn't remotely socialist. It's been a core priority for real Republicans going back to Abraham Lincoln and Dwight David Eisenhower. To ground this idiotic ideological food fight in something like reality, we brought in Gary Kasparov, a leading Russian dissident and long-reigning world chess champion. Gary grew up in the Soviet Union, so he knows what he speaks. Gary, great to talk with you as always. I know that overall you're concerned about the way unhinged attacks get volleyed around too easily in our democracy right now. But I want to start by asking you what you think when you hear all these Republican representatives calling Democrats communists.
Thank you very much for having me, John. It's a very important topic, and as you said, I had plenty of experience. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I don't take these accusations lightly. Socialism, though I am not in favor of the ideology, and I'm not, in favor of many things associated with social democrats, it's a very legitimate part of the liberal democracy of the free world, and the stability of the world after World War II was very much based on the two concepts, conservative and liberal social democrats, and in England, for instance, Labour and Tories, and that's how we balance political system. Slight shift to the left, slight shift to the right, but eventually, the politics stayed in the middle. To start using words like communist, it's, as you correctly stated, it's an insult for tens, hundreds of millions of victims of communism in the 20th century. And for me, someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, and someone who had to leave my country because the country is ruled by KGB, which is an offspring of communist criminal regime. So it's really painful.
Folks are always in danger of forgetting. What was it like growing up in the Soviet Union?
Sometimes when I tell stories about Soviet Union, it sounds almost ridiculous to young people. They say, no, it's impossible. Yeah, look, it's a country that that was dominated by ideology. If you had any opinion that would contradict party line, you could be in real trouble. You could go to jail, you could definitely lose your job. It's something that people don't recognize here. In America, you can say whatever you want about president, about the Speaker of the House, about the governor, and yeah, it could be maybe a libel case, but there's no KGB to go after.
It's such an important point. We don't appreciate what we have sufficiently. And some of this is myopia. Some of it is the narcissism of small differences that hyperpartisanship inflames. But it's also this historic amnesia. It's been 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And look, many real memories of communism have receded. When we come back, Gary will talk about how he knows the look that Vladimir Putin gave Donald Trump at the Helsinki summit. He's seen it before from the KGB. That's next. You are a very public and clear-eyed critic of Vladimir Putin, who, among other things, infamously said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Which is why one of the most bizarre role reversals in American politics is that Reagan-era Republicans used to be the most prominent hawks when it came to confronting Russian communism during the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Republicans are blasting President Biden for being too weak on Russia, but the de facto leader of their party, get this, is spending his time praising Vladimir Putin. Former President Trump going so far as to call Putin's moves, and I'm quoting the former president once again, he says Putin's moves genius.
I don't have any any physical proof of Trump's collusion with Russians, but I believe that, for some reasons, he had been operating, he has been doing Putin's bidding. Again, for those who say Biden looked very weak in Geneva. Yes, he was, but he didn't look pathetic as Trump in Helsinki. So the way Putin looked at Donald Trump, I know this look. That's how the KGB operatives looked at their assets. That's what I saw in Putin's eyes. Yeah, for some reasons, Putin believed that Donald Trump was an asset, and naturally, Trump was very helpful.
It is so striking to see how figures like Tucker Carlson and others on Fox are rooting for Putin.
This is the kind of political analysis Russia's state-controlled television apparently likes.
Но все это не означает того.
The main channel is putting together this montage of lines from a favorite anchor.
I can't fully imagine why someone like Tucker Carlson, who would continually every night basically put forward Russian talking points.
Tucker Carlson went even further than many on the far left who tried to have the moral equivalence between Soviet aggression and American counteractions. The argument, that's being used by Tucker Carlson is, well, we have to concentrate on China, we have other problems. Yeah, that's exactly what people, just in England and France have been saying in the 30s. Oh, don't upset Herr Hitler. We have to think about Soviet Union. That's not the way to deal with his growing menace.
This situation appears to become more chaotic by the day, possibly even spinning out of control. And that, we must be honest, is shocking to us. We've been taken by surprise by the whole thing. We're not the only ones who were, but we're willing to admit it.
I want to get to something else, a point you've made, because you do view politics from a nonpartisan perspective. You are, as I like to say, nonpartisan but not neutral. And I know you do consider some of the hypocrisies that attack you folks on the left, some version of the hyperbole and the disrespect for the real moral weight of the accusation we hear when the folks on the right call everyone a communist. Particularly, you say, when folks on the left call anyone they disagree with racist. Explain how you see those things are almost equivalent or an echo of each other.
Look, it's very unfortunate that you have one extreme that meets another extreme, because they point at each other and they find justification for their accusations and for their misuse of these words. Racism is associated with also heinous crimes. Yes. And also, we heard calls from the progressives say, the behavior of border police is like concentration camp. Come on. It's not just, insulting the memories of those who died in Auschwitz or Dachau, but again, it's Xinjiang now. We have concentration camps. We have people being killed there, tortured there, women being sterilized. Those are the horror stories of today. And throwing these accusations against fellow Americans, that creates the atmosphere where all the accusations can fly, right, left, and the center. And that's what we have to fight. Yes, we may disagree on how we want to handle the problem, but I don't think we can disagree on values. What we're hearing now from extremes on both sides, using words communist, fascist, racist, it's denigrating American political culture.
Gary Kasparov, thank you very much for joining us on Reality Check, my friend. Be well.
Thank you.
The aftermath of fierce fighting east of the Ukrainian capital. This is what you get when you invade Ukrainian land, the narrator says. Russian forces attempt to encircle Kyiv. Ukrainian military says it's defeated an entire regiment of Russian tanks and liquidated its commander. Drone video captured the armoured column in the city of Brovary being attacked and destroyed. Latest battlefield win in what is proving for now to be a determined Ukrainian stand. But on the diplomatic front, stalemate. Despite the highest level talks since this Russia-Ukraine conflict began, foreign ministers meeting in the Turkish city of Antalya, Ukrainian officials tell CNN the Russian side appeared unwilling or unable to make a deal.
We also raised the issue of a ceasefire, 24-hour ceasefire, to resolve the most pressing humanitarian issue. We did not make progress on this since it seems that there are other decision makers for this matter in Russia.
It's these gut-wrenching scenes in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol provoking wide international scorn. A maternity hospital devastated by Russian forces, according to Ukrainian officials, killing at least 3 people inside, including a child. Horrific images are circulating, like this one, of pregnant women blooded in the attack. Still, the Russian foreign minister is insisting this was a legitimate strike on a far-right Ukrainian militia, the Azov Battalion, not a war crime.
At the meeting of the UN Security Council, our delegation presented facts about this maternity hospital having long been seized by the Azov Battalion and other radicals, and they have driven all the pregnant women and the nurses out of it.
But in cities across Ukraine, trapped civilians are desperately escaping the fight. These, the latest scenes from Irpin, north of Kiev, where the city's mayor says nearly half the population has already fled. With no peace in sight, Ukraine's capital is emptying as Russian forces advance.
Well, Jake, shortly after meeting his Russian counterpart in Turkey, the Ukrainian foreign minister tweeted some absolutely horrific images of a toddler who was very badly injured being hurriedly evacuated from a suburb north of the Ukrainian capital, basically saying, along with that tweet, that look, this is why Putin has sent his army to kill Ukrainians, including children. He pointed out that over 70 children have so far been killed in this conflict. And the Foreign Minister of Ukraine saying that he will personally ensure that each war criminal faces justice. Jake.
Matthew Chance reporting live for us from Kyiv. Thank you. Stay safe. Here to discuss Democratic Senator Mark Warner. He's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Mr. Chairman, thanks for joining us. On the question of the U.S. helping the Polish government to send the Soviet-made MiG fighter jets to Ukraine, your colleague, Senator Jean Shaheen, Democrat of New Hampshire, told CNN, quote, "It's not clear why we are standing in the way." Earlier today and yesterday, 2 different former NATO Supreme Allied commanders told us that they think the U.S. should be trying to help the Polish government get these MiGs to Ukraine. Do you agree?
Well, Jake, I believe we are sending a lot of the 17,000 anti-tank tools, and I just was meeting with some of our British colleagues. I think they announced another 3,600. I think we need to get more of those Turkish drones that have been very effective. The question on the planes, I'd love to find a way to get the planes to the Ukrainians. What I need to get the answer to, though, is will the balance of NATO agree with this? I know there's some argument coming straight from Poland versus coming from a NATO American air base in Germany. Is that a distinction with the difference? And what I'm trying to get an answer to real time is part of the reluctance, the fact that other NATO members are reluctant to have that moving forward. Ukraine still has a substantial number of its airplanes that they are able to use. The truth is, a lot of the airspace, not all of it, but a lot of the airspace where the Russians have control, they also have control of the airspace. That's one of the reasons why you've not seen the existing Ukrainian Air Force, for example, bomb that long column that has been sitting for some time.
The Director of National Intelligence testified today that there's a new assessment about Ukraine that contributed to the decision of the Biden administration to not help these Polish MiGs get to Ukraine. Do you know of new intelligence suggesting that Vladimir Putin might see this as escalatory and possibly bomb Poland, bomb some other NATO ally?
Well, clearly, as some of the testimony that was even made in public today, that testimony that Odie and I at Haynes made was before my committee. This was the open threat hearing, and then we went into the closed session. I obviously can't speak about anything in the closed session, but there clearly is an escalatory ladder. Some of that is, of course, based upon judgments. One of the questions that I think were posed, and is it that much more of an escalation if the planes fly from a NATO base than if they were somehow transported in another way from Poland into Ukraine? And the question I want to answer is what do the balance of NATO nations say? This is a group that, so far, I think, again, because the Biden administration has worked hard to keep this coalition together, to build this coalition. I can assure you, a year ago, NATO was broken in the aftermath of Trump. It has been built back the last 4 months, particularly with our British allies. We've had to convince the reality of the threat, and now NATO has that. What I don't want to have happen is that unified force against Putin's aggression splinter in any way. And that's the question I'm trying to get the answer to.
There are all these pro-Russia social media accounts trying to convince the public that these news reports about Ukrainians suffering and dying are not true. They're false, and that the victims we've seen on TV are crisis actors. It's obviously offensive and false. What's your reaction when you see this propaganda campaign by Russia that these are crisis actors and not actually Ukrainian victims?
Well, Jake, as you may recall, when the war first started, I wrote all of the major social media platforms to not allow Russian entities to monetize themselves during this tragedy. And I'm a big critic of the social media platforms for the most part, but most of them took off. RT took off, Sputnik. Many of them made clear that there was not American advertising backing that. On the question, and I'm trying to get more into again on the fake social media posts, this is a little bit of a conundrum. We've got American companies who provide some of the internet backbone for the internet in Russia. Some of them are exiting, and on that level I applaud, and maybe some of those Russian social media fake videos cannot get out within Russia into the rest of the world. The flip side of that, of course, is that many of the images of opposition to Russia, there was a classic example recently where there was a governor out in Siberia at some form of town hall, and his citizens were basically saying, why did you send our young men who were in a police brigade to Belarus? You told us they were going for a training mission and they're being used as cannon fodder. So that obviously is where the internet was being used as a powerful statement for the Russian people to hear some of the protests. So getting this right, I do think the social media companies need to do more to take down these false videos. That is something, disinformation, misinformation, that we've been urging for some time. But taking down the whole internet inside Russia itself is a bit of a dual-edged sword at this point.
Breaking news tonight, new satellite images show that 40-mile-long convoy north of Kyiv was dispersed and redeployed using rocket launchers and towed artillery in fields and wooded areas. The question is what to make of it, which is why we're glad we can turn to retired Army 4-star General and former CIA Director David Petraeus. General Petraeus, appreciate you joining us. What is your reaction to these new images? What do you make of what that convoy is doing?
Well, it's really just adhering to normal standards that they should have been adhering to all along. Standards to which our soldiers trained is that when you stop, you don't stay on the road, you don't stay visible to anything from the air, you pull under cover, whether it is in the trees or whatever you can find. You certainly don't stay, again, exposed the way that they were for so many days. It was really, again, staggering that happened. And you saw in the footage that you're showing right now, in another case where an armored battalion is caught in the open, apparently by a drone that appears to be filming this. May have been directing the fire as well. And again, it's sort of unconscionable that this would happen. They're also bunched together, as you can see. You would always want to stay much farther apart than that. And so again, these are basic standards that clearly have not been established and have certainly not been followed in accordance with what normal standards would be for our forces.
Professor Ward was talking about the defenses which are everywhere. You see, like Kyiv, every street, hedgehogs, on sides of roads. And obviously we know about the Molotov cocktails that have been dispersed, and obviously the shoulder-fired weaponry and the other weaponry that the U.S. and others have sent in. Given that, is it likely Russian forces are just going to try to level these cities before actually going in? Because you've talked about before, they don't have enough troops to really adequately undertake
block-by-block urban
No, that's correct. Sure, it's also incredibly mentally draining. The bottom line now, I'm starting to think that they will be able to encircle. Again, that blow struck against the armor regiment, and by the way, the Russian in that clip that you played earlier is actually also reporting that the regimental commander was killed. That's an extraordinary blow. We had that, the other casualties, the other losses of armor, personnel, and so forth. You just can't keep sustaining that kind of loss. And the column from the east in particular, which is where this was ambushed, is so long and so vulnerable, given the logistical lines required for that, that there's just no way, I don't think, they're going to be able to sustain their forces coming in that direction, which means they probably can't get around to the south and really close the city off, which could be very, very good news for Kyiv, in the sense that at least it could be resupplied, even if the Russians try to lay siege to it from the other direction through the north and to a degree from the west. But as you notice, again, what they will do is back off, and they're just going to rubble the city block by block. But normally you would need to move in, at least to have observation of the fire, although they've certainly done lots of indiscriminate fire, as we've seen in the Mariupol in particular. And that situation, I think, is the one that's really eating at the President Zelensky, his Minister of Defense, the Chief of the General Staff, trying to figure out any way they could to lift that siege, to break through to Mariupol, to restore the basic services and so forth. But it's pretty clear they just don't have the reserves to do that, even though they've also stopped the Russians around Kharkiv. And that thrust that we discussed earlier from Crimea towards Odessa, it is stopped in a city called Mykolaiv, where the mayor is an absolute hero. He's turning into a real battlefield general and organizing an extraordinary defense. And if they're going to break the bridges and destruction, if they can't get across that river, they have to go much farther to the north and then down to the southwest to Odessa. And again, there's no way they'll maintain those logistical lines.
With Mariupol, which is a city it seems critical for Russian forces from their perspective to take, for future reasons, they've allegedly, according to the U.S. Defense Division, they've encircled it. Would it be possible for, I mean, is the same thing at play there, that to actually occupy that city, to move in, would be extremely difficult for Russian forces? Or, I mean, it's a much smaller city, obviously.
No, I think what they're trying to do there is literally starve it into submission. The water is cut off, the power is cut off. Very, very desperate situation. You showed how bodies aren't even, you can't even do proper burial of the bodies at this point in time. And so what they're going to do is starve it until it submits, until the officials there in charge surrender. I assume is their hope, because of course that will then enable them to complete the land bridge from Crimea to the Donbass area in southeast, so they will have denied that entire portion of the coast to Ukraine. And so it's really a matter of time, unless the Ukrainians can figure out how to break that siege somehow and get supplies in, restore basic services, and so forth. And I'm sure that that is the issue that is really bedeviling them. And as always, commanders allocate shortage. Never have enough of anything. And so what they may have to do is reallocate some forces from somewhere else where they seem to be doing better than perhaps the plan was developed initially to try to get down there. Otherwise, at some point in time, that will become the first major city in Ukraine to fall. It will also free up those forces that are in circulation to some degree at least. And that could be a problem elsewhere as well.
General, just one final question. Just from the perspective of the guerrilla fighter, how effective is a Molotov cocktail? Clearly, there are a lot of them around here, and I know they have an accelerant inside to make them stickier. One person here was telling me that against a tank or an armored vehicle, that those are closed systems that do have air intake, and that if you throw it at the air intake, it essentially smokes out the people inside the tank. Is that true?
Well, again, we have some views about the Russian systems so far aren't proven true. I mean, they're much less well equipped than we believe. And again, to believe that those systems work as advertised probably is worth at least asking about. What you really need to do is get the patents to have something. The normal way that's the way even our tanks going into Baghdad, they could get swarmed. And if the infantry is not around them to keep the enemy infantry off, in this case perhaps guerrillas, insurgents, you can have a problem at some point in time. But what you really want to do, obviously, is get the Molotov cocktail inside the tank turret. And to do that, you've obviously got to get them to pop those hatches. And again, there are various ways. You can also perhaps, depending on how exposed the engine grates are and so forth, there are places that are flammable, and that's what you're going to have to do with that. Against thin-skinned vehicles, they can be devastating, and there are other circumstances where it's very valuable. What you really have to do is swarm, and what we've seen, as we discussed earlier as well, Russians have been very poor at achieving combined arms effects. They send tanks alone without infantry, infantry alone without tanks, no engineers around them to help them with obstacles and so forth, and not supported by artillery creeping along in front of the fire along in front of them as required. So again, they could be very vulnerable. Or, as you saw, if they're out in the open and either ground or air observation can identify them, then the right forces can be brought to bear, as they were very impressively on that road. Again, you can't sustain that kind of loss day by day and still have combat effective forces.
So joining me now is Inna Sobsun. She is a member of the Ukrainian parliament who has stayed in Kyiv, in the Kyiv region, to help inform the world of the horrors of the war. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us, Inna. A senior U.S. defense official says that the Russians are approaching Kyiv from different directions. New videos showing fighting intensifying nearby. What's it like in your city now?
Well, it is tense, of course, as it has been from the day one of the war. We don't know whether the Russians will actually get into the city. We do get different news because on the one hand there have been heavy fighting from the northwest of the city, with the cities of Irpin and Bucha completely devastated, and we have all seen images of people trying to escape from those cities. Now they seem to be coming from the northeast, which is a different direction. There have been some battles yesterday over there. It seems like the Ukrainian army actually did make a good fight, and then many Russian convoys were actually stopped and killed, but there are many more coming. So we are fully aware that they can come into the city anytime, and that is a very scary perspective. Despite the city has been fortified basically with the territorial defense, with the checkpoints and all, there are just too many of them, and it's just scary to imagine what they can do to our city.
I want to put up this picture of you working with your rifle in the background. You have friends and family with the Army as you inform the world of the horrors of this war, but remain ready to fight. Now, based on what we have seen in other Ukrainian cities, do you think it could come to that? That you're actually picking up a gun and that you actually have to fight?
You know, I'm a university professor. That is not something I expected to have ever in my life. But that is what my life is right now. For 2 weeks, I haven't seen my son. He is with the family in the western Ukraine. I haven't seen my boyfriend. He's with the army. I haven't seen my parents, because my mom is in western Ukraine, and my dad is with the territorial defense helping evacuate people. I don't know what can happen. If someone told me, 3 weeks ago that this would be my life, I would never believe. This is what we turn to. I am now using my voice as a weapon. I am talking to the world and explaining what is happening here in Ukraine and why we need help in terms of securing our sky and ensuring the no-fly zone. But if that doesn't work, if the world does not react and does not help us, what else is there for me to do? I cannot just leave my city, I cannot leave my people, I cannot allow the Russians to take over. I've been building my life here in Kyiv for over 20 years. I've seen what they have done to my native city of Kharkiv, where I spent 17 years. They just bombarded it, basically turned it into Aleppo, with the whole world just pretending not seeing what is happening there. What else is there for me to do? I don't really see a big of a choice.
You mentioned the 9-year-old son that you mentioned. You said you haven't seen him in 2 weeks since the war began, and you shared this picture that he drew, and it says "No-Fly Zone." Listen, I can't imagine how difficult it is to explain to a child why their life was completely upended and mom needs to be away. What do you say to him?
That was probably the most difficult part of the last 2 weeks. When I had to call him, I wasn't calling him the first 3 days of the war because I needed to stay put. And then the 4th day he called me and we chatted and he said, "Mom, when will I see you again?" And that's when I started crying because I didn't know how to answer that question and when I will be able to see him again. So then I said I will call him back, and in a few hours I got myself together and I got ready for the talk. And I explained to him that the war is happening and that the children are sitting in the bunkers and that the Russians are throwing bombs on their heads. And he asked me, is there any way that we can protect those children? He got really scared. He's completely freaked out by the very idea of somebody dying. And now when it's so real, he got completely freaked out. And so I explained that we can protect the sky with the kind of support from the airplanes and other. And he said like, "Oh, we should build a roof," and that's what he drew on the picture. But he did cover the sun under the roof, so it's slightly wrong. But the whole idea is yeah, too. But this is how he feels, and that is he keeps on asking me, "Mom, how are the kids in the underground stations in the Kharkiv?" He drew another picture about Kharkiv. I didn't post that one, but he was particularly attached to Kharkiv because he knows that's my native city, so I was talking a lot to him about that. It's extremely difficult, but then I'm also feeling lucky that he's safe and he's not waking up to bombs every night like other children.
Do you worry that? I'm sorry, he's alive.
He's alive, and I'm reading news about other children not waking up in the morning, and that is just terrifying. That is the most scary thing for a parent to think about. I was reading about a report of a man who was trying to escape from Bucha, and 2 of his children were killed during the evacuation, and his wife. And that is something I can't even think about, how much pain he's in. So I miss my son, but I'm lucky that he's safe and well, and so is my boyfriend and my parents.
Are you worried that your son may never be able to return to his home in Kyiv?
I do. Yes, it is a real chance. I was thinking whether I should probably try to find some spot for him to go to school in Europe. I don't know. I don't want to do that. I still hope that there can be a relatively quick solution to kicking Russians out, but that frankly now depends on the level of support we shall get from the West. So yes, I am worried. And I don't want. He had his school, he had his friends here, he's missing his toys. He asked me if I can, transfer some of the toys to him, but it's impossible right now. I want him to have his life back. There is no good reason for him not having his life as it was. Just a crazy man in Kremlin deciding that he can just invade another state with no good reason.
What's his name?
Martin.
Well, we hope that you and Martin and your entire family stay safe. You're very brave, and we just appreciate you joining us and telling us what's going on. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
A former Russian oil tycoon is speaking out about Vladimir Putin and is claiming that the war in Ukraine has significantly reduced President Putin's ability to stay in power. His name is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was Russia's richest man and led the country's largest private oil company, Lukoil, before he spent a decade in prison for charges that most observers say were completely trumped up. Now, I spoke with him with the help of our interpreter. Mr. Khodorkovsky, you've been fighting Vladimir Putin for the better part of 20 years. Do you think that this war, as damaging as it will be to both Ukraine and Russia, do you think it will bring the end to Putin's regime?
This will depend on the outcome of the war. Right now, Putin is clearly suffering a defeat, but he can, of course, still kill very many people. If the West continues to support Ukraine, his own defeat is inevitable. Putin will always be the enemy of America. But since the start of the war, his term in power has been reduced significantly.
Given how insulated he is, both socially and financially, how sensitive do you think President Putin is to all of this economic pressure brought by the West, all of these companies that are now pulling out of Russia? How much of an impact does that have?
So the blow to the financial system has been enormous, and it is being felt. But at the moment, only 70% of the cash flows have been blocked. We need to block the remaining 30. If we want to stop Putin, there must be no exceptions.
You have said that the West needs to step up their sanctions and bring Russia financially to its knees, even if that will hurt everyday Russians. What more do you think needs to be done to inflict that kind of pain?
This isn't a question of putting somebody down to their knees. We need to stop the war. If we want to stop the war, then all the bank accounts of Russia must be frozen. All of Putin's bankers must be blocked. This needs to stop. Even if I've never advocated sanctions against Russia as a whole, but the financial flows need to stop. And yes, people will have problems. We will have problems. But these problems are incomparable to the problems of the people who are being killed and wounded.
What about the oligarchs who are close to Putin? Do they have any influence? These oligarchs who have been sanctioned, who have had their assets frozen, their yachts, their planes seized, do they have any sway, any pressure that they can put on President Putin?
Those people who you call oligarchs here, they are just Putin's footmen. They cannot influence him. However, he can use them as a tool of influence to influence the West. Therefore, it is absolutely important to stop all of these purse holders of Putin's until the war ends. They all must be blocked, and that's the only thing that will stop the war.
But if they say to him, you need to stop this war, does he listen to them?
Well, does a cleaner in your office, if she tells you or he tells you how to host a TV program, will you listen to them? Because that's all they are to Putin. They follow Putin's orders, and on Putin's orders, they can do things in the West. They have enough connections, they have enough money, and enough communication tools. If we don't want a war, if we want to stop the war, we must try and influence these people and we must block all their channels. And if you want to test as to who they are to Putin, try to interview, come up to them with a microphone and ask them, is Putin responsible for war crimes? Is what Putin doing a war crime? And judging by this person's public response, you will know who they are to Putin.
Подвержен или не подвержен влиянию Путина.
So how do you think Putin could lose power? Do you think some kind of coup is possible?
Это возможно.
Yes, a coup is possible, and this has happened in Russian history before. But at the moment, Putin is able to project a fairly positive picture to the Russian population. When it becomes obvious that he is losing, and this will be if the West keeps up its support for Ukraine, if the West allows a no-fly zone in Ukraine, this will save lives. If Putin looks no longer a winner, if he starts looking like a loser, then a coup is possible. But based on the Russian history and the experience of Russian history, we may yet have to wait a few years.
Нам ждать еще несколько лет.
Hey, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, thank you so much for your thoughts and for your time today.
Good luck.
The Putin that we've seen on television is increasingly inscrutable. Part of that is strategic. He is trying to make it very difficult for his opponents, whether within Russia or outside of Russia, to guess his intentions or mobilize against him.
Что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям,
с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
A lot of people obviously are asking, has Putin changed? Is something going on in his understanding of the world or in his ability to understand the world? The reality is we've been watching Putin now for 20 plus years that he's been in power, and he's changed quite a bit. It does feel like we're seeing a Putin who's more isolated. It's not just about sitting at the other end of a very long table from the people who are supposed to be advising him. It does feel that a lot of the messages that maybe he needs to hear are not coming across, either because people are unwilling to express them, or because 20 years into his reign, he trusts his own judgment more than he trusts the judgment of those around him.
Говорите прямо. Я поддержу предложение о признании. Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей. Поддерживаю предложение. Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
Early on in his presidency, Putin had these sort of marathon press conferences, he calls them. This was always a way of him both showing that he's very much in command, that he has a strong understanding of what's going on in the country, but also to play all sides of the political equation. He was very much trying to keep everybody on board. Putin famously was the first world leader to call George W. Bush on September 11th to express his condolences, but also to offer support.
I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
He gave up on that essentially beginning in 2012, 2013, as he began to face a much more concerted opposition at home, and he found that in order to sort of mobilize against that opposition, it was useful to pick up on conservative values, on the Russian Orthodox Church, pushing against LGBT rights. A key moment. Putin is coming back, campaigning for re-election as president, and gives his one major campaign speech. He takes the stage at Moscow's main football stadium, and as the snow is falling, gives this speech about, again, how this isn't just a campaign for political office, this is a campaign for the salvation of Russia.
Мы с вами народ победитель. Это у нас в генах, в нашем генном коде. Это передается у нас из поколения в поколение. Мы и сейчас победим. И я вас хочу спросить, мы победим?
His opponents aren't just Russian citizens who imagine a different political future for Russia, but they are agents of the West. Have his 2014 speech around the annexation of Crimea, in which he's harking back again to centuries of Russian history to legitimize this seizure of territory from a sovereign country, creating, in fact, a lot of political euphoria in Russia, a very powerful rally around the flag of that.
In our hearts, we know that Crimea has always been and always will remain an inalienable part of Russia.
In many ways, that speech was scary to a lot of people at the time, but it will look and feel now like halcyon days compared to the anger of the speeches that he's given in the lead up to the war that he's launched in Ukraine. He has a very strong demand for control. He seems to genuinely believe that Russia will disintegrate if there is not a very strong state that is able to dominate, if not monopolize, most political, economic, and indeed social activity within the country.
There are new satellite images that show the stalled 40-mile-long Russian convoy near Kyiv that we've been talking about now for days. It has largely dispersed and redeployed. Some of the units there have now repositioned into forests and tree-lined areas. So what does that mean? Let's bring in retired Army Major General James Spider-Marks to talk about this. Can you show us what these pictures are telling us and what it means for where these tanks are going?
Yeah, I think this is, frankly, good news for the Ukrainians. We've had that imagery of that convoy, 40-mile-long convoy, now being dispersed, which means supplies are not getting everywhere they need to go. There's a change in tactics, and they're getting off the road networks because they're concerned about imagery like this and also some potential targeting. So what you can see in this image is they're still on the road networks. But when you look over here, you can see the tracks. They're off the major roads. And then specifically here as well, you can see where there are a number of tanks for armored personnel carriers that are now getting off those main avenues of approach for protection.
It looks as if they've gone into a field behind a house.
Sure.
So they're seeking cover, basically?
Completely. What they're looking for, there's two things. Without getting inside too much military stuff, but it's cover and concealment. This is concealment, which means I want to get under trees, I want to tuck in next to buildings, I want to make it hard for anybody to really see me. Cover gives me protection from firing. In other words, big barriers and overhead cover that would really protect from bullets and missiles and rockets and artillery.
So that may be a good indication for the Ukrainians that they feel vulnerable, but could it also be an indication that they're getting ready for something?
Clearly what they're doing is the Russians felt very vulnerable on the major avenue of approach. The whole world could see that they were stalled, they weren't going anywhere, and you can't do anything when you're just lined up. You begin to disperse your units. Individual units like this can suddenly, non-commissioned officers and junior officers can get their troops together and begin to prepare for the next mission. You have a very difficult time when you just have this line of ducks on a road. So this gives them an opportunity to prepare. I see this in two ways. One, they're looking to protect themselves, to limit the amount of intelligence that can be derived from this display of vehicles on a major highway. And it also gives them an opportunity to prepare for the next move.
Joining us now is CNN military analyst and former Army Commanding General in Europe and 7th Army, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. General, I want to get to that satellite imagery, that new imagery that we've gotten of that infamous 40-mile-long convoy near Kyiv that we've been talking about for the better part of a week now. When you look at this imagery, it is now largely dispersed. What does that tell you about the force of that convoy and the potential impact that it could have on Kyiv?
Yeah, it tells me a couple things, Alex. First of all, that they have moved off the road and established what's called in military parlance a lager. They want to get under trees to try and establish some kind of camouflage. And they're doing this because they have been gradually picked off while sitting on this road by the weapon that we're going to hear more and more about are drones. These drones, these little killer drones, are going to be the signature weapon of this war, much like IEDs were of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They have been highly effective, but the Ukrainians don't have many of them. They had about 50 at the start of the war. They're trying to increase their supply of those because they have been so good in picking off these kind of targets in a very quiet manner. The Russians don't know they're coming. But going into the trees causes another problem. Okay, so you get out from the long stack of vehicles on a road, which can be hit by drones. You move into the trees to try to establish camouflage, then you are very susceptible to ambushes from weapons like the Javelin missiles or the smaller range AT-4 missiles or some of the other ones that they have, that NATO has given Ukraine to go against these armored targets. So, truthfully, the Russian vehicles that are moving either on-road or off-road are subjected to multiple weapon systems. And truthfully, I don't think moving off-road is going to help them all that much. But the important thing to remember is they're still there. They are stuck. They have been forced into a channel
with Ukrainian volunteers and now spends his days helping Irpin's most vulnerable escape.
When I saw the invasion, I honestly bought a plane ticket and got here as quick as I could. This feels like the biggest fight for freedom I've seen in my lifetime.
Have you ever been in a war zone before?
Not like this.
For most Americans, this would be a little out of their comfort zone.
This is a little out of my comfort zone. It's scary, when you hear the bombs going off, but at the same time, there's people a lot closer to it than us, and they're really the ones in harm's way, and we're just doing our part to get them out of here.
Lawyer Daria and her team risk their lives every day to do just that. She speeds through the deserted streets, looking for those who are stranded and need help. She's agreed to add Natalia's mother to the list.
So, Daria, are you not afraid to do this?
I'm afraid, of course. I don't have a child yet. And I understand that I can help people.
They reach the first stop. Shelling can be heard in the distance, and they need to move quickly.
You can feel how
This place is completely deserted. It's like a ghost town. Is the owner here? They shout. The team consults their list to check the address.
Наталья прислала за вами. Анатолий Васильевич.
But no one answers, and it's time to move on. In less than 2 weeks, Daria has seen the pleasant suburb of Kiev where she lives turned into a war zone.
Does it make you angry?
Yeah, I'm angry, and I think it's okay. I'm angry to all Russian people, because silence is also violence now. You or with Ukraine or with Russia.
We recognize the next stop. It's the address we've been searching for, but the first glance is troubling.
So this is the apartment complex where Natalia has told us that her mother lives. I'm just a little bit concerned because I can see there's some damage up there, presumably from artillery.
Team member Anton enters one of the buildings. Who is waiting for evacuation? He shouts. But there is no reply. Natalia's mother is nowhere to be seen. There is just a handful of people still living here. Ludmila and her husband tell us they chop wood in the forest and burn it to stay warm.
So she's saying that there's no water, there's no gas, there's no electricity. They cook their meals out here on an open fire.
Yet they refuse to leave. Where would we go? We don't have anywhere to go, she says. Whether they kill us here or there doesn't matter. When will these monsters leave? Across the road, Daria urges another couple to evacuate. But it's another no. They've made it this far, but are willing to see it through. The team has found one man, Oleg, who wants to get out. He bundles into the improvised rescue vehicle and sets off. Beyond the smashed windscreen lies the relative safety of Kiev's center. Back at the bridge, he tells us about his ordeal. It was an awful, frightening situation there, he says. They shelled us 24 hours a day. The rest of his family is in a city now held by Russian forces in the south. I don't know where I live anymore, he says, before bidding us goodbye. It's time to head back, our mission unfulfilled. We haven't found Natalia's mother. But as we get closer to the city center, our cell phone signal returns.
So we've just had some great news from Natalia. She tells me that a few hours ago her mother was successfully evacuated from Kiev by one of the volunteers.
Yet another family saved by ordinary citizens doing extraordinary work.
So where's the tripwire? I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. What would it take for NATO and the U.S. to actually be at war with Russia? Or are we already there? I asked the question because of the hair splitting that went on this week regarding Poland's supply of MiG-29 fighter jets. Poland surprised American officials by offering to turn over its aging Russian-made MiG fighters to Ukraine. But America balked when Poland wanted to transfer them through the U.S. and NATO and then have their fleet replaced with American-made fighter jets. The U.S. said the move could be considered, quote, escalatory and trigger a significant Russian reaction. My question, why would that make any difference in how Russia views the transfer of those planes? As the New York Times put it, in the midst of a remarkably unified alliance, the back and forth was a reminder that the joint effort to punish and ultimately repel Russia has a third rail that no one wants to touch. The Wall Street Journal said this: the bigger problem is the message this fiasco sends to Mr. Putin about NATO by so ostentatiously not sending the fighters and saying the reason is fear of escalation. Mr. Biden is telling the Russian what he doesn't have to worry about. It all reminded me of the elaborate workaround the United States devised when trying to adhere to the Neutrality Act during World War II, before the United States was bombed at Pearl Harbor. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sought to buy fighter planes from the United States. FDR asked England to send an aircraft carrier to pick them up. But England was short on aircraft carriers and asked instead for them to be delivered to its ally, Canada. The U.S. military personnel flying the planes to Canada would have broken the Neutrality Act. So here's what happened. The United States flew them to the border, drained them of fuel, and horses and trucks were then used to transport them the few hundred yards across the border where they were then refueled. That may then have followed the letter of the law, but it made pretty clear which side the U.S. would be supporting. Of course, 2 years later, Japan ended the Neutrality Act by bombing Pearl Harbor. In the current battle for Ukraine, American support has been even more extensive and expensive. By the end of February, the Biden administration had already given $1 billion in aid, including Javelin missiles, command launch units, and patrol boats. And the new appropriations bill passed by Congress allocates another $13.6 billion, including more than $10 billion of direct or indirect military-related aid. On top of the sanctions that Putin has already labeled an economic war, can the United States really think such moves are themselves not escalatory and won't provoke reaction from Vladimir Putin? Yesterday, a bipartisan group of 15 House members wrote to the president and asked the administration to step up its support, including supplying surface-to-air missile systems and facilitating the transfer of those fighter jets. 40 Republicans in the Senate said pretty much the same thing. President Biden on this topic said this yesterday.
The idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, just understand, don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say, that's called World War III, okay?
Still, why can the United States deliver millions and billions to be used for weapons, but still claim it's not directly involved? It all leads me to this week's survey question at S1.357. Should President Biden aid the transfer of aircraft and air defense systems to Ukraine? Joining me now to discuss is retired Navy Admiral James Stavridis, who spent 4 years as the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. He's written an all-too-relevant work of fiction just out called 2034, a novel of the next world war. Admiral, good morning. You have a PhD in international law. You were the dean of a graduate school of international law and diplomacy. You're the perfect person for me to ask, what exactly is provocation in this context?
Well, let's start with ground truth in international law here, which is Putin is the one provoking. Putin is the one invading. Putin is the one flagrantly violating international law. He hasn't declared war on Ukraine. He's simply invaded it. And he's throwing gasoline on a bonfire of war crimes by now purporting to bring Syrian volunteers to the battlefield. So, Michael, we got to start by saying the serial violator of international law here is Vladimir Putin. Having said that, okay, let's go over to our side of the coin here with the democracies. What can we do? And I think the false discussion here is that it's kind of an on and off switch. In other words, we just keep the switch off and we watch what happens in horror, or we flip the switch on and we send troops in, we put our jets over Ukraine. Neither of those answers are right. It's a rheostat, right? Like in your dining room, you kind of turn up the light. So what we're doing, in my mind, is about right, which is massive additions of military assistance. It is huge sanctions, and it is supplying very lethal but defensive weapons. We're not giving Ukraine anything that they could use to invade Russia. We're giving them the systems they need to attack Russians who are invading them. I think we're in the right place.
Okay, so in my house, if it were the thermostat, not the rheostat, I'd be the one turning it on and my wife would come along and then completely shut it off. Has Vladimir Putin completely shut it off? In other words, have you considered that he has, through back-channel communications, served notice? If you transfer those MiG fighters, that's it. It's game on with NATO.
I doubt it for a couple of reasons. First of all, he would not want to lay out a bold red line like that, and nor should we, by the way. I think we should stop saying we'll never do this, we'll never do that. We should say things like, at this time, we're not going to, etc. Point two here would be, he doesn't want to take on a conventional fight with NATO. He doesn't want a nuclear fight either. You know, he's got family. He loves his country. He's not going to reach for the apocalypse button. And he doesn't want a conventional fight with NATO because we outnumber him massively. There's this kind of misconception that somehow the Russian armed forces are comparable to NATO armed forces. Couldn't be further from the truth. We outspend them 15-1. We have a 5-to-1 advantage in troops, a 5-to-1 advantage in combat aircraft. You get the idea. So I think Putin is rattling that nuclear saber, hoping we will simply back down, and we just can't do that. We have to continue our course of action. The one thing you mentioned up front, the MiG-29s, I can see both sides of that conversation, but in my view, give them to the Ukrainians, figure out the logistics, put Ukrainian insignia on them, have Ukrainians fly them. I think it's a huge morale boost, and I think it also would have impact on the battlefield. It's a hard logistics problem, but we shouldn't back down and be scared of our shadow in terms of Vladimir Putin.
So my survey question today is asking our viewers, should the president aid the transfer of aircraft and air defense systems in Ukraine? Admiral Stavridis says yes.
I do, and I'll make a small caveat, which you didn't clarify in the question. I would not put U.S. pilots flying those aircraft that you refer to. And part of the reason there, Michael, is not only the international law, but it's also who's up there in the cockpit. You know, that's not Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, you know, kind of figuring out all the back and forth. That's who's in Maverick. And so, same thing on the Russian side. So the potential for an incident between nuclear armed powers is pretty high. Let the Ukrainians.
That's implied, by the way, Admiral, that's implied, that is implied in my survey question. I do not intend to suggest that they would be American pilots.
Gotcha.
Hey, you spoke to the Russian military capability. Yesterday, put this up, Catherine, the Washington Post said the following. 2 weeks after Russian forces streamed into neighboring Ukraine following months of buildup, evidence is mounting that the invasion has not gone to plan and that Russia's much-vaunted military may not be that formidable force that we once feared. That doesn't mean Russia won't ultimately seize Kyiv and topple the Ukrainian government, and it doesn't mean Ukraine won't pay a horrific price in both military and civilian casualties as it continues to do so daily. But the stumbling pace of Russia's assault since Vladimir Putin ordered troops into Ukraine late last month, marked by apparent confusion among commanders and viral images of downed Russian planes and tanks set alight, has reset expectations for how the conflict will unfold. Are you surprised by the Russian capabilities thus far?
I am not shocked at their failures. I think that they have improved over the force that I surveyed as the Supreme Allied Commander some years ago, but they still have three key faults that are on display here. One is they still have a high percentage of conscripts, reservists that they're putting into the fight. They're inexperienced, they're afraid, they seem very almost disoriented. Secondly, logistics. This has always been a shortfall for Russia. Logistics are hard. Professional militaries really do logistics well. We do that well. Russia's failing to get that forward. And third and finally, Michael, the generalship here, admiralship, has not been very good. The battle plan isn't good. There's a lot of confusion, and all three of those are weaknesses we've seen in Russia historically. I think Vladimir Putin was told, we corrected those, boss. Turns out, not so much.
President Biden warned Russian oligarchs his administration planned to seize their ill-gotten gains, and now the world is targeting the billionaire's extravagant yachts. Friday, Italian authorities in the port of Trieste seized the ship known as Sailing Yacht A, worth about $578 million, belonging to Andrei